What if the earliest written words weren't meant to record what happened, but to remember what came before? Before kings built ziggurats, before cities rose from marshland, before humanity, as the Sumerians understood it, became what it is today. In the British Museum, Yale and Baghdad, thousands of clay tablets rest in climate-controlled darkness, their surfaces covered in wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay more than 4,000 years ago. They speak of gods who descended, of a time before the flood, of knowledge given and a world transformed. The Sumerians called these beings the Anunnaki, and according to their oldest texts, these gods didn't just rule from a distance. They walked among humans, they taught, they changed everything about how civilization would unfold. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories where mythology and memory become impossible to separate. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. The tablets are fragile now, some no larger than a playing card, others the size of pillows, covered completely in script so dense it looks like fabric woven from words. But what they describe is anything but small. They describe a world before, a time when gods and humans lived differently, when the natural order was still being established, when the Anunnaki, according to these texts, shaped civilization in ways we're still trying to understand. When British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard first unearthed cuneiform tablets from the mounds of Nineveh in 1845, he had no idea he was holding conversations between gods and kings, instructions for rituals that predated the Bible, and descriptions of a world that existed before recorded history began. The tablets were everywhere, thousands of them, baked hard by fires that destroyed the libraries but preserved the words. And as scholars began the painstaking work of decipherment, one name appeared again and again, threading through creation myths, king lists, and cosmic battles: Anunnaki. The gods who came down from heaven, the ones who were here before. Layard was searching for Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital mentioned in the Bible, when his worker's spade struck something unexpected beneath a mound called Kuyunjik. Not gold, not statuary, but rooms, entire palatial chambers. Their walls lined floor to ceiling with clay tablets. Some were the size of a hand, others required 2 men to lift. All of them were covered in strange wedge-shaped marks that no living person could read. The fire that had consumed the palace of Ashurbanipal in 612 BCE had been catastrophic for the Assyrian Empire, but for these tablets it had been preservation. The intense heat had baked the clay harder than any kiln, turning fragile records into something nearly indestructible. Layard shipped crate after crate back to the British Museum, where they sat in storage for years, waiting for someone to unlock their meaning. The decipherment of cuneiform would take decades, the work of multiple scholars across Europe, each building on fragments of understanding. But when the breakthrough came, when Henry Rawlinson and others finally cracked the code using the Behistun inscription as a Rosetta Stone, the tablets began to speak, and what they said was staggering. There were king lists stretching back thousands of years. There were prayers to gods whose names appeared nowhere in classical literature. There were astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and legal codes more sophisticated than anything Europe had seen until the Renaissance. But it was the mythological texts that captured scholars' imaginations. These stories of creation and flood, of divine councils and cosmic battles, and woven through nearly all of them was this word, Anunnaki. At first, translators thought it might be a title, or perhaps a place name. But as more tablets were discovered, as the picture became clearer, they realized the Anunnaki were beings, deities of some kind, who according to these ancient texts had descended from heaven and walked among the first humans. The tablets described them in assembly, making decisions that affected all of creation. They described them in conflict with each other, divine politics that spilled over into human affairs, and most intriguingly, they described them as teachers, as the source of civilization itself, as if humanity hadn't slowly developed writing and agriculture and law, but had received these gifts fully formed from beings who already possessed them. Layard died in 1913, having revolutionized archaeology, but never fully understanding what he'd found. The work of translation continued in universities and museums across Europe, each new tablet adding pieces to a puzzle that became more complex the more complete it became. By the early 20th century, scholars like Leonard Woolley and Samuel Noah Kramer were excavating not just palaces but the ruins of the world's oldest cities, finding tablets that pushed the dates back further and further until they were reading texts composed over 4,000 years ago in a language that had been dead for 2 millennia before Christ was born, and those earliest texts, the ones from Sumer itself rather than later Babylonian or Assyrian copies, spoke most clearly about the Anunnaki, about a time before the flood, about a world that was organized differently, where gods and humans occupied the same space, where divine knowledge flowed freely, where the natural order was still being established. The more scholars translated, the more they realized these weren't just stories. These were historical memories, cultural records of how the Sumerians understood their own past. They truly believed the Anunnaki had been here, that they had changed everything, that the world before their arrival was fundamentally different from the world that came after. Cuneiform wasn't invented all at once, and it wasn't originally designed to record epic poetry or conversations with deities. The earliest marks, pressed into clay around 3200 BCE, were simple accountings, tallies of grain and livestock, proof of transactions. But buried beneath these economic records, in the oldest strata of Sumerian writing, are fragments of something else entirely. Stories passed down orally for generations, possibly millennia, before anyone thought to commit them to permanent form, and when they finally did, when the first scribes began recording the mythological past, they wrote about a time before cities, before kings, before the Anunnaki descended and changed everything. The evolution is visible in the tablets themselves if you know what to look for. The very oldest examples, from Uruk around 3200 BCE, are pictographic, simple drawings that represent concrete objects. A circle with lines means sheep, a triangle means woman. These aren't yet writing in the full sense, just sophisticated record keeping, a way to track temple inventories and trade transactions. But within just a few centuries something remarkable happened. The pictographs became abstract, stylized into wedge-shaped marks that could represent not just objects but sounds, ideas, grammatical particles. Writing in the true sense had emerged, and almost immediately within a generation or two of this transformation, scribes began using their new tool to record something other than economics. They wrote down the old stories, the ones that grandmothers had told children, that priests had chanted in temples, that communities had preserved in collective memory for as long as anyone could remember. Stories about the beginning of things, about how the world came to be, about the gods who had organized chaos into order. The earliest literary tablet we possess. A fragment from Abu Salabik dating to around 2600 BCE already shows sophisticated narrative structure and poetic techniques. This wasn't a scribe inventing literature. This was a scribe recording literature that already existed in elaborate, polished form. The implication is profound. The oral traditions these early texts preserved were already ancient when they were first written down, refined over countless retellings, carrying memories from a time before writing existed. And in those memories, the Anunnaki are always present, not as distant creators who made the world and departed, but as active participants in establishing civilization. One tablet describes how writing itself was a gift from the gods, part of the me that Enki distributed to humanity. Another explains that before the Anunnaki organized the world, humans lived like animals, without language, without law, without understanding. The tablets don't claim humans invented civilization. They claim it was taught, transmitted, given by beings who already possessed this knowledge. Linguists have traced Sumerian back as far as the evidence allows, but it remains a language isolate, unrelated to any other known tongue. It's not Semitic like Akkadian. It's not Indo-European. It stands alone, its origins mysterious, as if it appeared fully formed in southern Mesopotamia without ancestors or relatives. And the Sumerians themselves had an explanation for this linguistic uniqueness. According to the myth, quote, zero, there was a time before the confusion of languages when all humanity spoke a single tongue, the pure speech that the gods had taught. Only later, through divine intervention, did languages multiply and scatter. The parallel to the biblical Babel story is obvious, but the Sumerian version is older by over 1,000 years. So when we read these tablets about the Anunnaki, we're not just reading mythology in the modern sense, pleasant stories that ancient people told around fires. We're reading what the Sumerians considered to be their actual history, the true account of where they came from and how they learned to be civilized. Whether that history is literal, metaphorical, or some complex mixture of memory and meaning, the tablets themselves are unambiguous. Before the Anunnaki there was only chaos. After their arrival and their teaching there was order, there was civilization. There was humanity as the Sumerians understood it. The Sumerian king list is one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world. Compiled around 2000 BCE, but drawing from far older sources, it begins with a simple statement. Quote, 1. Then it lists rulers whose reigns stretched for tens of thousands of years. Not metaphorically. The text is clear and specific. Before the flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,000. 200 years. Then, the text says, the flood swept over, and when the waters receded, kingship descended from heaven once more, but differently this time. The lifespans shortened. The world had changed. Something the Anunnaki had established was gone. The first king listed is Alulim, who ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. The second is Alaljar, who reigned for 36,000 years. On and on the list continues, each ruler's tenure measured in millennia rather than decades. Modern scholars call these mythological kings, and perhaps they are. But the Sumerian scribes who compiled this list didn't mark any distinction between the antediluvian kings and the historical rulers who came later. The format is identical. The precision is the same. City names, ruler names, reign lengths, all recorded with bureaucratic consistency, as if the scribe was simply copying older records, transcribing information he believed to be factual. And then comes the break. 5 words in English, even fewer in Sumerian, marking the boundary between ages. After this statement, the list resumes, but everything has changed. The first king after the flood is Joshua, who ruled in Kish for 1200 years, still extraordinarily long by our standards, but a fraction of the pre-Diluvian reigns. The next king ruled for 960 years, then 830. The lifespans are declining, approaching something that, while still exaggerated, begins to feel more plausible, more human. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, the reign lengths have become historically verifiable. Ur-Nammu ruled for 18 years, Shulgai for 48 years. These are real kings, confirmed by multiple sources, their monuments still standing, their administrative records filling museum archives. The king list transitions seamlessly from myth to history, from impossible reigns to documented facts. Without ever acknowledging that a transition has occurred, what are we to make of this? Scholars have debated for over a century. Some argue the pre-Diluvian kings are purely mythological, symbolic of an idealized past. Others suggest the numbers might be textual corruptions, or that the Sumerians used different calendar systems in different eras. Still, others propose the long reigns represent dynasties rather than individuals. Compressed genealogies where each name stands for a whole line of rulers. But the tablets offer their own explanation, consistent across multiple texts. Before the flood, the world operated under different rules. The Anunnaki walked among humans more directly. Lifespans were extended, either through divine blessing or through conditions that no longer exist. And kingship itself was a divine gift, something that literally descended from heaven, conferred by the Anunnaki upon chosen humans who ruled as intermediaries between earth and sky. The list explicitly states this: kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically emerged from human social organization, not gradually developed through political evolution. Descended, given, established by divine decree. And after the flood, it descended again, but diminished, operating under new limitations, new boundaries between mortal and divine. What's more, archaeological evidence does show a massive cultural discontinuity in ancient Mesopotamia. Not necessarily a universal flood, but a period of disruption around 3500 BCE when earlier settlements were abandoned and new cities arose with suddenly sophisticated organization. The kingless division between antediluvian and post-diluvian eras might preserve memory of this actual historical break, this moment when something fundamental changed about how Mesopotamian civilization was organized. The list exists in multiple copies, discovered at Nippur, Lhasa, and other sites. Each version varies slightly in details, but all preserve the same basic structure: mythological kings of impossible age before the flood, transitioning to increasingly historical rulers afterward. The Sumerians clearly considered this document important enough to copy and preserve for over 1,000 years. It wasn't fiction to them. It was their history, their understanding of how kingship began, how the Anunnaki organized human society, and how the flood marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. In the sun-scorched emptiness of southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of Ur, a low mound rises from the desert floor. This is Tel Abu Shahrain, and beneath its wind-carved surface lie the remains of Eridu, which the Sumerians claimed was the very first city. Not the oldest we've found, necessarily, but the first according to their own historical memory, the city of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, the place where, according to multiple texts, civilization began under the guidance of the Anunnaki. When archaeologists excavated Eridu in the 1940s, they found temple layers going down 19 levels deep, each built directly atop the ruins of the previous one, stretching back to around 5400 BCE. At the bottom, they found something unexpected. A culture already sophisticated, already building monumental architecture as if it appeared fully formed. The excavation was led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, working for the Iraqi Department of Antiquities. They chose Eridu because of its prominence in Sumerian literature. Every king list began there. Every creation myth mentioned it. It was, according to the tablets, where kingship first descended from heaven, where Enki established his temple, where the me of civilization were first organized and distributed. If the Sumerian texts were to be believed, Eridu was the starting point, the place where the transformation from wilderness to civilization occurred. What they found exceeded expectations. Beneath the windblown sand, beneath meters of accumulated debris, they discovered not one temple, but a sequence of temples, each built directly on top of its predecessor, creating a stratigraphic record of continuous worship spanning over 3,000 years. The earliest temple, level 19, was a small building, barely more than a single room, with an offering table and a niche for a divine statue. But it was carefully constructed, oriented to cardinal directions, built according to a plan that already understood sacred architecture. Level by level, they excavated upward through time. Each new temple was larger than the last, more elaborate, more sophisticated. By level 12, the temple had multiple rooms, courtyards, elaborate drainage systems. By level 6, it was a complex structure covering hundreds of square meters, with thick walls, buttresses, and decorative niches. And at the top of the sequence, they found the massive ziggurat that would have dominated the landscape in the 3rd millennium BCE, a stepped pyramid proclaiming Eridu's sacred status to anyone approaching across the flat desert plain. But it was the earliest levels that fascinated archaeologists most, because the pottery found in association with the first temple was Ubaid ware, a ceramic style dating to around 5400 BCE, making this one of the oldest monumental structures in Mesopotamia, and yet there was no trial and error visible in its construction, no experimental phase. The first temple showed knowledge of architecture, understanding of sacred space, planning and execution that suggested the builders already knew what they were doing. This is the pattern that appears repeatedly in early Mesopotamia, and it's the pattern that makes the Sumerian texts about the Anunnaki so intriguing. Civilization doesn't seem to gradually develop. It appears suddenly already sophisticated, as if the knowledge was there from the beginning. At Eridu, the earlier settlers were already building temples, already organizing their community around worship of Enki, already employing architectural techniques that wouldn't look out of place centuries later. The temple's location was equally significant. Eridu sat at the edge of the marshlands where the Euphrates River spread into countless channels before reaching the Persian Gulf. This was the boundary between land and water, between ordered cultivation and wild wetlands. And Enki, the god of Eridu, was lord of the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth from which springs and rivers flowed. His temple stood literally at the meeting point of his two domains, built where underground water surfaced into the world above. Sumerian mythology explains Eridu's primacy clearly. In the beginning, before cities, before kings, the Anunnaki organized the world. They assigned each god a domain, a sphere of influence and responsibility, and Enki, wisest of the Anunnaki, received the waters, both those above and those below. He established his residence at Eridu, built his temple there, and from that sacred center, he began teaching humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, irrigation, the organization of communities, the laws that would govern city life. Multiple texts describe Enki in his temple at Eridu, surrounded by the Mi, the divine principles that made civilization function. From here, he dispensed them to other gods, to other cities, and to humanity itself. Eridu was the source point, the origin, the place where it all began, and what's remarkable is that the archaeological record doesn't contradict this. Eridu truly is among the oldest cities. Its temple sequence truly does go back to the dawn of Mesopotamian civilization. Whether the Sumerians were preserving accurate historical memory or projecting their understanding of sacred geography backward into mythological time, the correlation between text and archaeology is striking. The city eventually declined, abandoned sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE as the Euphrates shifted course and the climate became more arid. By the time Alexander the Great passed through Mesopotamia, Eridu was already ancient ruins, its temples buried, its glory forgotten except in the tablets that still named it first among cities. But beneath those ruins, the 19 temple levels remained, layer upon layer of devotion to Enki, physical evidence of Sumer's longest continuous sacred site. The place where, according to those who lived there, the Anunnaki first gave humanity the knowledge to build, to write, to organize, to become civilized. The Atrahasis tablet, discovered in fragments and painstakingly reconstructed, tells a story that predates the biblical flood narrative by over 1,000 years. But the flood is just the climax. What makes Atrahasis extraordinary is what it describes before, a time when the Anunnaki alone inhabited the earth, performing grueling labour, digging rivers and canals, shaping the landscape itself. The text is explicit. For 40 years, the Anunnaki dug. For 40 more years they suffered. They carried baskets of earth. They excavated the Tigris and Euphrates, until finally, exhausted and rebellious, they demanded change. And according to the tablet, that's when everything shifted. That's when humanity was created, not out of love, but out of necessity, to take over the work the gods no longer wanted to do. The epic survives in multiple copies, the most complete from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, but older fragments from Babylon and Sippar prove it was known across Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. The story is divided into 3 tablets, but it's the opening section that reveals the most about the world before humanity existed. It begins with a division of labour among the Anunnaki. The great gods cast lots, and Anu, father of the gods, took heaven. Enlil took the earth, and Ea, also called Enki, received the waters below. But the earth needed to be made habitable, needed to be shaped and organized before it could support life, and this work fell to the lesser gods, the Igigi. Younger deities who served the great Anunnaki. The text describes their labour in detail that still resonates with discomfort. They dug the riverbeds, carving channels through solid earth so that water would flow from the mountains to the sea. They excavated canals for irrigation, back-breaking work under the Mesopotamian sun. They carried baskets of dirt year after year for 40 years according to the tablet. Their divine hands blistered. Their divine backs bent under loads of earth and stone, and they suffered. The text uses that word specifically. Divine beings created to serve, experiencing something that God shouldn't experience: pain, exhaustion, resentment. And finally, they rebelled. The tablet describes it vividly. The Igigi set fire to their tools, threw down their baskets, and marched on Enlil's temple in the night, surrounding it, demanding an end to their torment. Enlil, terrified and outraged, called the other great gods to council. What should be done about this divine insurrection? How should immortal beings who refuse to work be punished? But it was Ea who saw the solution. If the work was necessary and the gods refused to do it, then someone else must be found. A worker must be created. And so the Anunnaki in council decided to make humanity. But the text is clear about the purpose. Humans were created to bear the load that the gods no longer wanted to carry. We were made to dig the canals, to plant the fields, to maintain the temples, to do the work that even divine beings found too burdensome to continue. The creation process is described with almost technical precision. They slaughtered one of the rebellious gods. As a deity named We'ila, and from his blood and flesh, mixed with clay, the mother goddess Nintu formed humans. 7 males and 7 females, the first breeding population. She chanted an incantation over them, giving them breath and life, and then she declared their purpose. They would bear the load of the gods. They would perform the labour that had exhausted the Anunnaki. They would maintain creation so that the gods could rest. This is not the Genesis account where God lovingly forms humanity in his image. This is creation born from necessity, even desperation. Humans weren't made to be companions for the divine, weren't crafted as the pinnacle of creation. We were made to be workers, to solve a labour shortage in the cosmic economy. The tablets don't romanticize our origins. They explain them with uncomfortable honesty. You exist to serve, to work, to bear burdens too heavy for those who made you. And for a time, it worked. The text describes humanity multiplying, spreading across the earth, taking over the agricultural and construction work that had previously exhausted the gods. The Anunnaki withdrew to their temples, receiving offerings and worship while humans maintained the irrigation systems, planted the crops, and kept civilization running. The divine beings rested. The system functioned. But then something unexpected happened. Humans multiplied beyond the gods' intentions. We became too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The tablet says the earth became full, and the noise of humanity was like a bellowing bull, disturbing the sleep of Enlil. He couldn't rest. The very beings created to give the gods rest had become a source of irritation themselves, and so Enlil proposed a solution: destroy them. Send plague, then famine, then drought, and finally the flood to wipe the earth clean of the noisy, troublesome creatures that had exceeded their purpose. The other Anunnaki agreed. Humanity's time was over. The experiment had failed. Better to start again, or perhaps do without workers entirely, than endure the chaos that human multiplication had created. But it was the tablets, always the tablets, that carried forward what happened next, how one god dissented, how Ea chose preservation over destruction, and how the world as we know it survived only through divine disobedience and human ingenuity. In authentic Sumerian religion, the Anunnaki were divine judges, deities of the earth and underworld, distinct from the Agigi who served in heaven. The word itself breaks down. Quote, the 3, referring to the sky god An. Quote, Pafotsen, suggesting princehood or nobility, and quote, Fafpakvam, meaning earth. Literally, quote 6, they appear in nearly every major Sumerian and Akkadian myth, sometimes numbering 7, sometimes 50, once described as 600 in total. They weren't aliens, not in the original texts. They were gods in the way ancient Mesopotamians understood divinity, powerful beings who predated humanity, who established cosmic order, who could be temperamental, political, even petty. but they were real to the people who wrote these tablets, real enough to build temples for, real enough to fear. Understanding the Anunnaki requires stepping away from modern interpretations and returning to what the Sumerians actually wrote, what they actually believed. In their cosmology, the universe was populated with layers of divine beings, hierarchies of power and responsibility. At the top stood the great gods, An, the Sky Father, Enlil, Lord of Wind and Storm, Enki, Master of Wisdom and Water, Inanna, Goddess of Love and War. These were the major Anunnaki, the ones who made decisions that shaped reality itself. Below them were the minor Anunnaki, lesser gods assigned specific duties. Some governed particular cities. Others controlled natural phenomena like rain, harvest, or disease. Still others served as divine judges, particularly in the underworld, where they determined the fate of human souls. The Descent of Inanna describes 7 Anunnaki judges sitting in the underworld, their eyes fixing on the goddess with gazes of death, their voices pronouncing judgment that could end even a deity's existence. But the Anunnaki weren't just distant cosmic bureaucrats. The tablets describe them gathering in assembly, debating, arguing, forming factions. They had personalities, preferences, rivalries. Enlil was stern, quick to anger, protective of divine prerogatives. Enki was clever, sympathetic to humanity, willing to bend rules. Inanna was ambitious, demanding, ready to challenge even greater gods for power and recognition. These weren't abstract forces. They were beings with agency, with emotions, with agendas that sometimes aligned with human interests and sometimes conflicted catastrophically. The relationship between Anunnaki and humanity, as the tablets describe it, was complex and often uncomfortable. Humans owed their existence to the gods but weren't beloved creations. We were workers, servants, maintainers of temples and offerers of sacrifices. The gods needed us, in a sense, to perform the labor they no longer wanted to do themselves, but they also found us troublesome, noisy, prone to multiplication and disorder. The tension runs through every text. Humans were necessary but also problematic, useful but also irritating, created with a purpose but constantly threatening to exceed or betray that purpose. This is vastly different from how later cultures understood divinity. The God of the Bible creates humanity in his image, loves us despite our failings, seeks relationship. The Anunnaki created humanity for function, tolerated us when we served properly, and were willing to destroy us when we became inconvenient. There's no cosmic love story here. There's cosmic pragmatism, divine self-interest, and a world where gods and humans coexist in necessary but often strained cooperation. Yet the Sumerians devoted enormous resources to honoring these gods. Every city had its patron deity, an Anunnaki assigned to protect and guide that particular community. Temples dominated the urban landscape, employing significant portions of the population. Festivals, offerings, elaborate rituals, all designed to keep the Anunnaki satisfied, to maintain the relationship, to ensure the gods continued providing the order and stability that made civilization possible. Because that was the fundamental belief. Without the Anunnaki, there would be no civilization. The natural world was chaos, dangerous, unpredictable. It was the gods who imposed order, who made the sun rise reliably, who ensured rivers flooded at the right time, who kept disease and disaster from overwhelming humanity completely. The Anunnaki were the source of cosmic law, the Mat of Egypt or Dharma of India, the principle that kept reality functioning rather than dissolving back into primordial formlessness. And this belief wasn't abstract theology, it was lived reality. When drought came, it was because an Anunnaki was angry. When harvest was abundant, it was because the gods were pleased with offerings. When a king died young, it was because the divine assembly had decreed his fate. The Anunnaki weren't just believed in, they were experienced as the active forces governing every aspect of existence, from the cosmic scale of seasonal cycles down to the personal scale of illness, fertility, and fortune. So when we read tablets describing the Anunnaki descending from heaven, teaching civilization, organizing the world, we're reading documents from a culture that understood those events as real history, as actual interventions by actual beings. Whether we interpret those beings as deities, as metaphors for natural forces, as cultural memories of some historical transformation, or as something else entirely, the Sumerians had no doubt. The Anunnaki were real. They had been here. They had changed everything, and they were still present, still watching, still judging, still maintaining the order that separated civilization from chaos. The Babylonian creation epic, recorded on 7 tablets discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library, describes a universe born from violence and divine struggle. Before anything existed, there was only Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt sea, mingling their waters together. From this primordial union the first gods emerged, and among them were the Anunnaki. But the epic makes clear, even the Anunnaki had to fight for the world as it exists now. When the younger gods killed Apsu and Tiamat in cosmic battle, they created heaven and earth from Tiamat's split body. They established natural laws. They assigned the Anunnaki their duties. The world before this conflict, the text suggests, was fundamentally different. Formless, undefined. A place where the boundaries between water and land, heaven and earth, chaos and order had not yet been drawn. The Enuma Elish, meaning when on high, takes its name from the opening words, and it represents perhaps the most complete cosmology to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Discovered in fragmentary form across multiple excavations, but primarily from Nineveh, it was recited annually during the Babylonian New Year festival, a ritual recreation of the cosmic order that the epic describes being established through divine violence. The story begins in a time before time, when nothing existed except 2 primordial beings, Apsu, embodying all fresh water, and Tiamat embodying the salt ocean. These weren't gods in the full sense yet. They were the raw material of existence, pure elemental forces without form or consciousness. But they mingle their waters, fresh and salt mixing together, and from this mingling, the first generation of gods began to emerge. The text describes this emergence with imagery that still resonates. Quote 9, the first divine beings were Lamu and Lahamu, silt gods, the sediment that forms where rivers meet the sea. Then came Anshar and Kishar, horizons of sky and earth, and from them more gods emerged, including Anu and eventually Ea, also called Enki, the wisest of the young deities. But these young gods were noisy, active, disturbing the primordial stillness that Apsu and Tiamat preferred. The parallel to the later Atrahasis story is striking. Once again, divine beings find the activity and noise of others intolerable. Apsu complains to Tiamat that he cannot rest, cannot sleep, disturbed constantly by the younger god's motion and sound, and he proposes a solution: destroy them, wipe them out, return to the silent emptiness that existed before. Tiamat resists at first, reluctant to destroy her own offspring, but Apsu is determined. He consults with his vizier Mummu, and together they plot the annihilation of the younger gods. except Ea, clever and wise, learns of the plan. Through magic and cunning, he casts Apsu into a deep sleep, kills him, and establishes his own dwelling upon Apsu's body. Mumu he binds and takes prisoner. The primordial father is dead, and the younger generation has won its first victory. But the story is far from over. Tiamat, enraged at her consort's murder, raises an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, scorpion men, storm demons, all birthed from her primordial power. She appoints King, one of the first gods, as her champion, and gives him the Tablet of Destinies, the cosmic authority that controls fate itself. And she prepares to destroy not just the young gods, but reality as they've begun to organize it. The young gods are terrified. None of them can face Tiamat's fury, until Marduk, son of Ea, steps forward. He's young, powerful, willing to fight, but he demands a price. If he defeats Tiamat, he must be made king of all the gods. His word must become law. His decrees must be unchangeable. The divine assembly agrees. They have no choice, and Marduk goes to battle. The combat is described in vivid, almost visceral detail. Marduk catches Tiamat in a net of winds. When she opens her mouth to swallow him, he drives the storm wind into her, inflating her body until she cannot close her jaws. Then he shoots an arrow through her mouth, piercing her heart, killing the primordial mother. Her army flees, King surrenders, and Marduk stands victorious over Tiamat's corpse, and then comes the act of creation. Marduk splits Tiamat's body like a shellfish into two parts. From one half he creates the sky, establishing it as a barrier to hold back the upper waters. From the other half he creates the earth, solid ground rising from the primordial ocean. He positions the stars, assigns the gods their stations, creates the moon to mark time, establishes the calendar. The world as we know it is being organized. Carved from the body of chaos itself, the Anunnaki are assigned their duties during this cosmic reorganization. Marduk creates stations in heaven and mirrors them on earth. He establishes 300 Anunnaki in the heavens and 300 on earth, 600 divine beings total, each with a specific role in maintaining cosmic order. They are judges, administrators, guardians of the natural laws Marduk is establishing. The epic makes clear the Anunnaki didn't create this order. They enforce it, maintain it, operate within it, and finally Marduk decides that the gods need servants to maintain all this newly established order. From the blood of Kingu, leader of Tiamat's rebellion, Ea creates humanity. We are fashioned from the blood of a rebel god, formed to serve, to bear the burden of maintaining creation so the Anunnaki can rest. The tablets don't hide the implication. Human nature carries something of that original rebellion, that cosmic defiance, but channeled now into service rather than chaos. What's remarkable about the Enuma Elish is its vision of reality as fundamentally violent, fundamentally contested. The world exists not through peaceful decree but through combat, murder, dismemberment. Order is carved from chaos by force. The Anunnaki preside over a universe that required cosmic warfare to bring into being, and the stability we experience is maintained only through constant divine vigilance against the forces of disorder that preceded creation and still threaten at its edges. This was the world the Babylonians believed they inhabited, a cosmos organized by violence, maintained by divine authority, always potentially vulnerable to sliding back into the primordial chaos from which it was wrested. And it was the Anunnaki, established in their roles by Marduk after his victory, who kept that chaos at bay. In Sumerian mythology, Enki holds a unique position among the Anunnaki. While other gods ruled or judged, Enki taught. Dozens of texts describe him giving humanity the me, divine laws or cosmic principles that governed everything from kingship to metalworking, from writing to weaving. Without the me, Sumerian texts suggest civilization couldn't function. Humans would have remained primitive, disconnected from the knowledge needed to build cities, create art, or organize society. One tablet describes Enki traveling to Eridu with the me, establishing them in his temple, and from there dispensing them to humanity. The implication is clear. Before Enki's intervention, before the Anunnaki shared this knowledge, the world existed but civilization did not. Humanity was here, but not yet human in the way the Sumerians understood themselves. The me are among the most fascinating and most mysterious concepts in Sumerian thought. The word itself has no precise translation into English. Sometimes it's rendered as divine decree, sometimes as cosmic principle, sometimes simply left untranslated. But in Sumerian understanding, the me were the fundamental building blocks of civilization, discrete packets of knowledge or authority that could be possessed, transferred, even stolen. The fullest description comes from the myth Inanna and Enki, where the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki in his temple. Enki, pleased by her visit and perhaps influenced by beer, begins giving Inanna the me one by one. The tablet lists them in remarkable detail. Over 100 me are named: kingship, godship, the priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of warfare, plundering of cities, setting up of lamentations, rejoicing of the heart, music, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, destruction of cities, wailing, craft of the smith, craft of the basket weaver, craft of the leather worker, craft of the builder, wisdom, understanding, purification, fear, terror, strife, peace, weariness, victory, counsel, the troubled heart, judgment, decision. The list is comprehensive and bewildering, mixing abstract concepts with practical skills, emotions with technologies, virtues with vices. But the underlying concept is consistent. These are the things that make civilization possible, and they exist as transferable principles that can be given, received, or stolen. Enki possessed all of them, stored in his temple at Eridu. And Inanna, clever and ambitious, got him drunk and convinced him to give them to her. When he sobered up and realized what he'd done, he sent demons to retrieve the me, but Inanna had already reached her city of Uruk and deposited them in her own temple beyond his reach. The story reveals something crucial about how the Sumerians understood knowledge and civilization. These weren't things humans discovered gradually through experimentation and cultural evolution. They were gifts, teachings, transmissions from the Anunnaki who already possessed them. Metalworking wasn't invented by trial and error. It was part of the me given by Enki to humanity. Writing wasn't developed slowly from pictographs. It was taught, complete with its power to record a law, poetry, and divine wisdom. Other texts describe Enki traveling throughout Mesopotamia, establishing the me in different locations, assigning different gods responsibility for different aspects of civilization. He goes to the riverbanks and decrees that the rivers will flow reliably. He visits the marshlands and establishes the abundance of fish and fowl. He enters the sheepfolds and ensures the multiplication of livestock. He approaches the plough and the furrow and institutes agriculture. Each visit, each decree, is Enki organizing the world, imposing order, making civilization possible through divine intervention. What did the world look like before Enki dispensed the me? The tablets suggest it was formless in a functional sense. The physical world existed, created from Tiamat's body. Humans existed, created to serve the gods. But the knowledge needed to actually build civilization, to move beyond simple survival, wasn't present. Humans lived scattered, disconnected, without the arts that would let them organize into cities, create lasting works, develop the complex social structures that characterize Sumerian culture. Enki changed that. According to the tablets, he saw humanity's potential, recognized that we could become more than simple laborers if given the right knowledge, and so he taught. The me of kingship allowed political organization. The me of metallurgy enabled bronze tools and weapons. The me of writing made record-keeping and literature possible. The me of law permitted justice and social order. One by one, Enki dispensed the principles that would transform humanity from workers into builders of civilization. But there's a shadow side to this gift. Some of the me are distinctly negative: strife, terror, destruction of cities, the troubled heart. These too are part of civilization, and Enki gave them as freely as the positive me. Civilization, in Sumerian understanding, wasn't purely good. It was complex, containing within itself both creation and destruction, both order and chaos, both wisdom and folly. The me made all of it possible, and Enki, as their dispenser, bore responsibility for the full spectrum of human experience. The location of this teaching is significant. Eridu, the first city, Enki's own sacred space. This is where the transformation happened, where humanity received the knowledge that would let us build Ur and Uruk, Nippur and Lagash, all the great cities of Sumer. Eridu was the source point, and from there the me radiated outward, carried by Enki to other locations, stolen by Inanna for Uruk, gradually spreading until all of Mesopotamia participated in the civilization that divine knowledge had made possible. The tablets are clear. We didn't invent civilization. We received it, learned it, were taught it by Enki and the other Anunnaki, who possessed this knowledge from the beginning. Whether this is metaphor or memory, theological explanation or historical record, the Sumerians believed it absolutely, and they honored Enki for it, building temples, offering sacrifices, maintaining his cult for thousands of years as recognition that without his gift of the me, they would still be formless, scattered, barely human at all, fragmented and incomplete. The Eridu Genesis tablet contains what may be the oldest written version of the flood story. Discovered in 1893 at Nippur, it predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years and differs in crucial details. In this version, the decision to destroy humanity comes from the Council of Anunnaki, but one god, Enki, defies the others. He warns a man named Yusudra, instructing him to build a boat. But the tablet's most intriguing element is what it describes before the flood decision, a world where humans had multiplied beyond the gods' expectations, creating noise and disorder that disturbed the Anunnaki's rest. The flood wasn't punishment for sin, it was population control, a reset. And after the waters receded, the text says, the Anunnaki granted Yusudra eternal life, and placed him in Dilmun, a paradise beyond the mortal world. The world after the flood, these tablets suggest, operated under new rules, new boundaries between human and divine. The Eridu Genesis tablet was found in fragments at Nippur by the University of Pennsylvania expedition, mixed among thousands of other tablets in the temple archives. Its condition is frustrating for scholars. Large sections are missing, the clay worn away or broken off, leaving gaps in the narrative that can only be filled through comparison with later versions of the same basic story. But what survives is extraordinary, a window into how the Sumerians themselves understood the catastrophe that reset their world. The tablet begins with creation, though the opening lines are lost. By the time the text becomes readable, cities already exist, lowered from heaven by the Anunnaki. The tablet names 5 cities specifically: Eridu, Bad Tibia, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. Each city is assigned a patron deity. Each is given kingship, and humanity multiplies, spreading throughout Mesopotamia, building, farming, filling the land. But then something changes. The tablet's description is terse but powerful. Humanity's noise becomes unbearable. The earth resounds with human activity, and the gods, particularly Enlil, cannot rest. The parallel with Atrahasis is exact, suggesting this was a consistent element in Sumerian flood mythology. Humans weren't sinful in the biblical sense. We were loud, numerous, disruptive to divine peace. The Anunnaki Council gathers and makes a decision. Humanity must be reduced. First they try disease, sending plague to thin the population. But Enki, always humanity's advocate, teaches people healing and medicine, and the plague passes without fully solving the problem. Then they try drought, withholding rain for years. But Enki ensures that springs and underground water continue flowing, and enough humans survive. Finally, the council decides on total destruction. A flood to wipe the earth clean, to drown every human, to reset creation to the state before humanity became so troublesome. And here, Enki commits an act of cosmic disobedience. He's sworn an oath with the other Anunnaki not to warn humanity. But he finds a loophole. He goes to Ziusudra's house and speaks not to the man but to the reed wall. Quote, 13. The tablet records him saying. Quote, 14. Ziusudra, the pious king of Shurupak, hears Enki's warning through the wall and understands. The tablet breaks off here, but comparison with the later Akkadian versions lets us fill in what happened next. Ziusudra builds a boat, enormous, multi-decked, watertight. He loads it with animals, with grain, with his family. And when the flood comes, when the storm breaks and rain falls for 7 days and 7 nights, when the storm god Ishkur unleashes divine fury and water covers the earth, Ziusudra and his boat survive. The description of the flood itself is lost in the broken sections of the tablet, but when the text resumes, the waters are receding. Ziusudra opens a window and sunlight floods into the boat. He prostrates himself before Utu, the sun god, offering sacrifice. The boat comes to rest on a mountain, and the Anunnaki, seeing that one human has survived, that Enki has once again thwarted their intention, must decide what to do. The remarkable thing is what happens next. Enlil is initially furious that any human survived. But Enki pleads Ziusudra's case. He was pious, he was righteous, he deserved preservation, and the council relents. More than relents, they grant Ziusudra something unprecedented. They give him eternal life, divine breath, and transport him to Dilmun, the mythical paradise, to dwell there forever beyond the reach of mortal death. This is radically different from the biblical flood, where Noah simply lives out his natural lifespan after leaving the ark. Ziusudra is transformed, elevated, made something more than human. He becomes a bridge between the antediluvian age and the new world, a preserved fragment of the time before, living proof that the Anunnaki had once walked more closely with humanity, had once granted divine gifts more freely. and the text makes clear that after the flood things changed. The Anunnaki re-established kingship, but differently. They rebuilt cities, but with new boundaries between divine and human. The intimacy of the earlier age was gone, replaced by a more distant relationship mediated through temples, priests, and ritual. Humans could no longer hear the god speak directly, as Ziusudra had heard Enki through the reed wall. The Anunnaki withdrew to their heavenly realms, descending only on specific occasions, maintaining order but from a distance. The flood was a boundary, a break, the end of one age and the beginning of another. Before, a world where gods and humans interacted more freely, where divine knowledge flowed more directly, where lifespans were extended and the rules governing reality were somehow more flexible. After, the world we recognize from historical records, with human lifespans measured in decades rather than millennia, with divine communication requiring elaborate ritual, with a clear separation between mortal and immortal realms. The Eridu Genesis preserves this understanding, this memory of catastrophe that reset everything, and it preserves the name of the man who survived, who carried the old world into the new, who lived forever in paradise as proof that before the flood, the Anunnaki had established something different, something that the waters washed away but that memory pressed into clay, refused to let die completely. In the Louvre and the British Museum, tablets covered in astronomical calculations reveal a sophistication that shouldn't exist for Bronze Age civilization. Star catalogues, planetary movements, mathematical predictions of celestial events accurate to within minutes. The Sumerians divided the sky into constellations and assigned each to an Anunnaki deity. They tracked Venus with obsessive precision, recording its cycles in tables that spanned centuries. But here's what's strange. The oldest astronomical texts don't read like observations being made for the first time. They read like records being copied from earlier sources, as if the knowledge was inherited rather than discovered. Multiple tablets refer to, quote, 15 astronomical knowledge preserved from an earlier time. Whether this is historical memory or mythological embellishment, scholars still debate. But the tablets themselves are clear. The Sumerians believed their understanding of the cosmos came from the Anunnaki, taught in a time before their current civilization existed. The astronomical sophistication visible in Sumerian tablets has puzzled scholars since decipherment began. These were supposed to be Bronze Age agriculturalists, people whose technology was limited to bronze tools and simple irrigation. Yet their astronomical knowledge rivals cultures that came centuries or even millennia later. They identified the planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They understood these were different from stars, wandering across the sky in predictable patterns. They calculated the length of the lunar month to remarkable accuracy. They predicted eclipses. They maintained observational records spanning generations. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, dating to the 17th century BCE but copying even older observations, track Venus's appearances and disappearances over 21 years with precision that still impresses modern astronomers. The tablets record when Venus first becomes visible in the east before sunrise, how long it remains visible, when it disappears, how long it stays invisible, and when it reappears in the west after sunset. The cycle repeats with regularity that the tablets capture in mathematical tables, allowing prediction of future appearances. But Venus wasn't just an astronomical curiosity to the Sumerians. She was Inanna, goddess of love and war, the most unpredictable and powerful of the female Anunnaki. Her movements in the sky were read as omens, divine communication about earthly events. When Venus appeared bright and high, Inanna was ascending in power. When she disappeared into the sun's glare, she was descending to the underworld, and human affairs would suffer accordingly. The astronomy and theology were inseparable. Understanding celestial mechanics meant understanding divine intention. The same integration appears throughout Sumerian astronomical texts. The moon was Nana, later called Sin, the father of Inanna and Utu. His phases marked time, determined the calendar, regulated festivals and agricultural activities. The Sumerians developed a lunar calendar with intercalary months added periodically to keep it aligned with the solar year, a sophisticated solution requiring long-term observation and mathematical calculation. But this wasn't abstract science. It was sacred knowledge, the tracking of a god's journey through the sky, the measurement of divine time. The stars, too, were assigned divine identities. The constellation we call Taurus was the bull of heaven, sent by Anu to kill Gilgamesh. The constellation we call Leo was associated with kingship and divine authority. The path the sun followed through these constellations, what we call the ecliptic, was the highway of the gods, the route along which the major Anunnaki travelled as they influenced earthly events. And here's where the mystery deepens. The oldest are catalogues, fragments dating to the late 3rd millennium BCE, describe constellations and stellar positions with accuracy that suggests systematic observation over very long periods. But they're written as if recording knowledge that already existed, copying from earlier sources, preserving rather than discovering. Multiple tablets include phrases like, according to the old texts, or, as was known before the flood, before the flood. That phrase appears repeatedly in astronomical contexts, suggesting the Sumerians believed at least some of their celestial knowledge predated the catastrophe that reset their civilization. Whether this is literally true, whether there was astronomical knowledge from an earlier culture that the Sumerians inherited, or whether this is simply a way of investing their understanding with ancient authority, remains hotly debated. But the sophistication is real. The mathematical techniques used in astronomical calculations required understanding of multiplication, division, square roots, and geometric principles. The Mlapin tablets, compendiums of astronomical knowledge compiled in the late 2nd millennium BCE, but drawing from much earlier sources, contain star lists, planetary periods, shadow length throughout the year, and instructions for using celestial observations to determine time and season. They describe the heliacal rising of stars, the appearance of stars just before sunrise at specific times of year, a phenomenon that requires careful observation over complete annual cycles. Where did this knowledge come from? Modern scholarship attributes it to generations of priestly astronomers, carefully observing and recording night after night, season after season, gradually building up predictive tables, and certainly that played a role. The Mesopotamian priesthood did maintain continuous observational programs, and their records show the accumulation of data over time, but the Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. They said the Anunnaki taught them that Enki, wisest of the gods, revealed the patterns of the heavens, that the celestial motions were divine, the movements of gods themselves, and understanding them required divine instruction. The astronomical knowledge wasn't discovered, it was transmitted, given, taught by beings who already understood the cosmos perfectly, because they had organized it, because they had assigned each planet its path, each star its position, each constellation its significance. And perhaps most intriguingly, some texts describe the Anunnaki not just as teachers of astronomy, but as active participants in celestial events. The gods descended from heaven, travelled between earth and sky, resided in celestial realms, Were these pure metaphors, poetic ways of describing divine transcendence? Or were the Sumerians describing something more literal, actual movements between locations, between Earth and stars? The question hovers over every astronomical tablet, every star list, every planetary table. Were the Sumerians simply very good observers who developed sophisticated techniques over generations? Or did they inherit knowledge from an earlier time? Preserved through the flood in the memories of survivors like Ziusudra, knowledge that had been taught when the Anunnaki walked more closely with humanity. The tablets themselves insist on the latter, and the sophistication of what they contain makes the question harder to dismiss than modern scholars might prefer. Nippur was never a capital. No dynasty based its power there, yet for over 2,000 years it remained the religious centre of Mesopotamia, sacred to Enlil, chief of the Anunnaki Council, and because of this sanctity, generation after generation of scribes copied tablets there, creating libraries that accumulated text from across Sumer and Akkad. When the University of Pennsylvania excavated Nippur beginning in 1889, they found over 30,000 tablets, the largest single collection from ancient Mesopotamia. Within those tablets were multiple copies of creation myths, hymns to the Anunnaki, rituals for communicating with specific gods, and king lists that connected historical rulers to divine authority. What emerged from Nippur's dusty archives was a consistent mythology. Before the current order of things, the Anunnaki established civilization. They taught writing, agriculture, mathematics, and law. And critically, they did this after the flood, rebuilding what had been lost in the catastrophe that reset the world. The city sits in the desert about 100 miles south of modern Baghdad, a desolate mound now called Nufa. When the Pennsylvania expedition arrived in the late 19th century, nothing suggested the treasures buried beneath centuries of sand and rubble. But the tablets had mentioned Nippur prominently, describing it as Enlil's sacred city, the place where divine authority was confirmed, where kings from across Mesopotamia travelled to receive legitimacy for their rule. The excavations were difficult, plagued by heat, disease, and occasional violence from local tribes, but tablet after tablet emerged from the temple complexes and scribal schools. Unlike royal archives at other sites, which primarily contained administrative records, Nippur's libraries held literature, mythology, religious texts. This was a city devoted to preserving sacred knowledge, to maintaining the connection between past and present, between divine origin and contemporary practice. The tablets were stored in specific buildings, temple libraries and scribal academies where young priests learned to read and write by copying ancient texts. This practice of copying turned out to be invaluable for modern scholarship. Because scribes learned by reproducing older tablets, Nippur preserved multiple copies of the same text, allowing scholars to fill in gaps where one tablet was damaged by comparing it to another. The Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, hymns to Inanna and Enlil, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, all existed in multiple versions, each copy adding slightly different details or preserving lines lost in other manuscripts. What struck archaeologists and translators as they worked through Nippur's collections was the consistency of the mythology across different texts and time periods. Whether a tablet dated to the 25th century BCE or the 18th century BCE, the basic framework remained the same. The Anunnaki had organized the world, taught civilization, established kingship, and maintained cosmic order. The details varied, different texts emphasized different gods or events, but the fundamental narrative was stable across a millennium and a half of continuous copying and recopying. This wasn't the work of a single author, or even a single generation. This was cultural memory, preserved and transmitted through one of humanity's oldest scribal traditions. The young students who sat in Nippers' tablet houses, carefully pressing their styluses into soft clay, copying myths their great-great-great-grandfathers had also copied, were maintaining a line of knowledge that stretched back to the very beginnings of writing itself. And Nippers' central role in this preservation wasn't accidental. The city was neutral ground, sacred to all Mesopotamian states regardless of which dynasty currently held power. When kingdoms rose and fell, when capitals burned and dynasties ended, Nippur endured, its temples protected by religious sanctity, its libraries growing as scribes fled other cities and brought their knowledge south to this protected centre. The Ekur, Enlil's great temple at Nippur, became the symbolic heart of Mesopotamian religion. Even kings who ruled from Babylon or Ur would make pilgrimage to Nippur, would leave inscriptions at Enlil's temple, would sponsor scribal activity there. Because control of Nippur, or rather recognition from Nippur's priesthood, conferred legitimacy. The city held the oldest copies of the king lists, the most complete versions of creation myths, the authoritative text that connected contemporary rulers to the divine mandate established by the Anunnaki in the time before. When the tablets speak of the world after the flood, of the Anunnaki re-establishing civilization, they describe a process of teaching and transmission. The knowledge existed before, in the antediluvian age, but the flood destroyed most of it. What survived had to be taught again, copied again, preserved in more permanent form. And Nippur became the centre of that preservation, the place where the wisdom of before the flood was written down, maintained, and transmitted to future generations who would otherwise have lost all connection to that ancient time, when gods and humans lived in closer proximity. The 30,000 tablets are scattered now, divided among museums in Philadelphia, Istanbul and Jena, but they remain the most complete window we have into Sumerian religious thought, into how an entire civilization understood its origins, its relationship to the divine, and its place in a cosmic order established by the Anunnaki, thousands of years before any scribe sat down to record these stories in permanent form. When Samuel Noah Kramer began translating Sumerian tablets in earnest during the 1940s and 50s, he approached them as literature and religious texts, products of a sophisticated culture trying to understand its place in the cosmos. His translations emphasized the poetic and mythological dimensions, but in 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published quote 18 offering radically different interpretations of the same texts. Where Kramer saw gods, Sitchin saw extraterrestrials. Where traditional scholars read metaphor, Sitchin insisted on literal interpretation. The academic community rejected Sitchin's work almost universally, pointing to mistranslations, selective quotation, and fundamental misunderstandings of Sumerian grammar. Yet his ideas spread widely, creating a parallel interpretation that persists despite scholarly consensus. The question remains, what do the tablets actually say? And does our modern framework even allow us to understand what the Sumerians were trying to communicate about the Anunnaki and the world before? Kramer devoted his life to Sumerian literature, publishing translations and analyses that remain foundational to the field. He approached the tablets with scholarly rigor, learning Sumerian grammar from the ground up, comparing texts, identifying patterns, placing each myth in its cultural and historical context. When he read about the Anunnaki descending from heaven, he understood it as theological language. the way ancient people described divine transcendence. When tablets described the creation of humanity from clay and divine blood, he saw myth, meaning-making, stories that explained human nature and purpose within a religious worldview. His translations revealed a sophisticated culture, poets who crafted complex narratives, thinkers who grappled with questions of suffering, justice, mortality, and divine will. The Sumerians in Kramer's work emerged as fully human, their myths no more literal than Greek stories of Zeus throwing thunderbolts, or Egyptian tales of Ra sailing across the sky in a boat. These were powerful metaphors, culturally specific ways of understanding reality, deserving study and respect, but not literal belief. Then came Sitchin, an economist and amateur scholar who argued that mainstream academics had missed the point entirely. The Anunnaki, he claimed, weren't gods in the mythological sense. They were aliens, extraterrestrials who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, mined gold, genetically engineered humans to be workers, and whose technological civilization was later remembered as divine. Every reference to the Anunnaki descending from heaven was, in Sitchin's reading, a literal description of spacecraft. Every mention of divine knowledge was advanced technology. Every god name was an individual alien being. He translated the Sumerian word quote, 19 quote, as quote, 20 quote, which became central to his thesis. He claimed the Sumerians had knowledge of all the planets in the solar system, including a theoretical 12th planet called Nibiru from which the Anunnaki originated. He read descriptions of divine councils as accounts of alien meetings, creation myths as genetic engineering projects, and the flood as a natural catastrophe the aliens knew was coming but initially chose not to prevent. The academic response was swift and harsh. Assyriologists pointed out that Sitchin's Sumerian was often simply wrong, that he cherry-picked passages while ignoring contradictory evidence, that his translations violated basic grammatical rules. They noted he had no formal training in ancient languages, that his methodology was flawed, that he misunderstood the cultural context of every text he cited. Major universities, museums, and scholarly journals rejected his work categorically. Yet Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. They offered a compelling narrative for readers frustrated with academic caution, people who wanted definitive answers rather than scholarly ambiguity. His theory spread through popular culture, influencing television shows, documentaries, and internet discussions about ancient mysteries. A parallel interpretation emerged, one that most professional archaeologists and linguists rejected, but that captured popular imagination in ways scholarly translations never could. The gulf between these interpretations raises uncomfortable questions. Is it possible that both are wrong? That the truth about what the Sumerians meant, what they experienced, what they were trying to communicate, falls somewhere neither purely mythological nor literally extraterrestrial? That our modern categories, our division between religion and science, metaphor and fact, don't map cleanly onto how Bronze Age peoples understood reality. The tablets themselves resist easy categorization. They contain genuine historical information mixed with mythology. They describe real places alongside impossible events. They record astronomical observations of remarkable accuracy alongside gods riding across the sky. They speak of the Anunnaki teaching civilization as if it's straightforward history, not symbolic or metaphorical, but actual transmission of knowledge from beings who possessed it to humans who didn't. Perhaps the Sumerians were describing real experiences in the only conceptual framework available to them. Perhaps what they called gods were something else, something we don't have words for, something that doesn't fit our categories. Or perhaps Kramer was right, and these were myths pure and simple, humanity's earliest attempts to explain existence through story. Or perhaps something stranger, something that combines elements of both, something that requires us to expand our understanding of what's possible in human history and experience. The debate continues, scholars publishing carefully argued papers while popular writers sell books claiming ancient astronauts. The tablets sit in museums, indifferent to interpretation, their cuneiform marks as clear now as when they were pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago. They say what they say. The question is what we're capable of hearing, what our assumptions allow us to understand, and whether the distance between our world and theirs is so vast that full comprehension may be impossible, regardless of how well we translate the words. Scattered across multiple collections, fragments collectively called, quote, 21 describe humanity's formation in specific, almost technical detail. According to the Enuma Elish version, after the gods killed the rebel deity Kingu, they mixed his blood with clay to create humans. But earlier Sumerian versions, particularly in the Atrahasis epic, give different details. The goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag, the birth goddess among the Anunnaki, created humans by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god. 7 divine birth goddesses shaped 14 humans, 7 male and 7 female. The purpose was explicit: to serve the gods, to perform agricultural labour, to maintain the temples. Before this creation, the texts consistently describe the Anunnaki doing this work themselves. After, humanity took over and the gods rested. The tablets don't romanticize human origins. We were, according to these texts, made to be workers, created for a specific function in a cosmic economy. The creation accounts vary in detail but agree on fundamentals. Humanity wasn't the pinnacle of divine planning. We were a solution to a problem, a response to divine discontent with the existing order. The gods needed workers and decided to create them rather than continuing to labour themselves or punishing the rebellious Igigi who'd refused to work any longer. The Atrahasis version provides the most detailed account of the creation process itself. After the Anunnaki Council decided humans must be made, they summoned Nintu, the mother goddess, expert in formation and birth. She agreed to create these new beings, but she needed materials. The gods provided clay, the base substance of earth. But clay alone wouldn't produce living, thinking beings capable of complex labour. Something divine was required, something that would give humans consciousness, will, the capacity to understand instructions and perform work. So the gods selected Wi'ila, one of the Igigi rebels, and slaughtered him. The text is explicit about this, describing it not as punishment exactly, but as sacrifice, the transformation of one form of divine life into another. They mixed his blood with the clay, and the god's flesh and blood became the animating force within human bodies. From divine rebellion, from the deity who refused to work, came the essence that would be passed to humans who would be created specifically to work. Nintu needed the clay mixed with divine blood, and 14 birth goddesses, lesser deities under her direction, took portions of this mixture. 7 formed males, 7 formed females. They placed these clay figures in the womb chambers of the goddess, and there they matured for 10 months, like natural birth but occurring within divine space rather than human bodies. When the time came, the birth goddesses delivered 14 humans, the first breeding population, made to multiply and fill the earth with workers. But the text notes something crucial. The humans carried within them the blood and flesh of Wi'ila, the rebel god. This wasn't accidental. The Sumerians understood that human nature included something of that original rebellion, that refusal to simply accept the work assigned without question. We were made to serve, but we carried within us the essence of the God who refused to serve. The tension was built into our creation, divine obedience mixed with divine rebellion, an unstable combination that would define human history. The purpose was stated clearly in the council's decision. Let him bear the load of the gods, let man take on the toil of God. The Akkadian words are direct, unambiguous. Humans would maintain the irrigation canals the Igigi had dug. We would plant the fields, harvest the grain, make offerings to the temples. The gods would rest, no longer exhausted by physical labor, sustained by human worship and work. And for a time, as we've seen, this arrangement functioned. Humans multiplied, spread across Mesopotamia, built cities, maintained agriculture, kept the temples supplied with offerings. The Anunnaki withdrew to divine realms, descending occasionally to their temple homes, but no longer performing the grinding daily labor that had driven the Igigi to rebellion. The system worked until humans became too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive, leading to the flood and the reset that followed. What's remarkable about these creation accounts is their honesty about human purpose and limitation. Other creation myths from other cultures often depict humanity as the beloved children of gods, created for companionship or glory. But the Sumerian texts don't offer that comfort. They say, "You were made to work, shaped from clay and rebel blood, created to solve a divine labor shortage. Your purpose is service. Your nature includes both obedience and rebellion. You exist at the pleasure of beings more powerful, and when you become inconvenient, those beings may choose to destroy you and start again." This understanding permeated Sumerian culture. The temples employed significant portions of urban populations, and service to the gods was understood not as voluntary piety, but as cosmic duty, the fulfillment of the purpose for which humans were created. When someone worked in the temple gardens, maintained irrigation systems or prepared offerings, they were doing exactly what the Anunnaki had designed them to do. Labor wasn't a curse from the fall, as in biblical tradition. Labor was the reason for existence itself. The tablets preserve this uncomfortable truth across multiple versions, copied and recopied for over 1,000 years. The Sumerians knew what they were, understood their place in the cosmic hierarchy, and built their civilization around the acknowledgement that they served purposes greater than their own desires. The Anunnaki had created them. The Anunnaki had defined their role. And the proper human response was to fulfill that role as effectively as possible, maintaining the order the gods had established, preserving the civilization the gods had taught, hoping that obedience might spare them from divine displeasure and the catastrophic resets that displeasure could bring. In Sumerian literature, Dilmun appears repeatedly as a paradise, a place before death, disease, or suffering existed. The poem Enki and Ninhursag describes it as a pure land, where the lion doesn't kill, the wolf doesn't snatch lambs, and humans don't know sickness or aging. Enki lived there with Ninhursag before the organization of the world. Some scholars identify Dilmun with Bahrain, where archaeological evidence shows extensive Sumerian contact. But in mythological terms, Dilmun represents something more, the world before the Anunnaki imposed order, before divine law structured reality, before the knowledge of good and evil, before the boundaries between human and divine were firmly established. The tablets describe Dilmun as lacking fresh water until Enki provided it, suggesting even paradise required divine intervention to become habitable. After the flood, according to the Eridu Genesis, the survivor Ziusudra was taken to Dilmun, implying it existed outside normal geography. Beyond the reach of mortal disaster, a preserved fragment of the world before, the myth quote 24 opens in this paradise, describing it with language that echoes later biblical accounts of Eden but predates them by over 1,000 years. Quote 25. The repetition emphasizes absolute purity, a place untouched by the corruption and decay that characterize normal existence. The text continues with its catalogue of impossibilities, things that don't happen in Dilmun because the natural order hasn't yet been fully imposed. The raven doesn't cry out, the partridge doesn't chirp, the lion doesn't kill, the wolf doesn't snatch lambs. No one says, quote, 26, quote. No one says, quote, 27, quote. Old age and death don't exist. These aren't miracles in a world where suffering is normal. These are descriptions of a world where suffering hasn't yet been introduced, where the natural laws that govern our reality haven't been established. But Dilmun has a problem. No fresh water. It's paradise, but waterless, unable to support life despite its purity. And so Ninhursag asks Enki, Lord of the Waters, to provide. He calls to Utu, the sun god, to bring fresh water from the earth. And Utu obeys, raising water from below, filling Dilmun with wells and springs and flowing streams. Only then, only after divine intervention organizes even paradise, does Dilmun become the fertile garden the later tablets describe. The myth continues with Enki eating forbidden plants in Dilmun, plants that Ninhursag had grown and forbidden him to touch. When he eats them anyway, she curses him and he falls ill, various parts of his body beginning to fail. The parallels to Eden are striking. Paradise, forbidden knowledge represented by plants, consumption leading to curse and suffering, but the resolution is different. The gods intervene, Ninhursag is persuaded to heal Enki, and she creates 8 healing deities, one for each of Enki's afflicted body parts. Paradise is restored, but the episode reveals something important. Even in Dilmun, even before the full organization of reality, disobedience led to suffering, and suffering required divine intervention to heal. Archaeological evidence places the mythological Dilmun in a real location. Bahrain, an island in the Persian Gulf, shows extensive Sumerian trade connections dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. Seals found in Bahrain match Sumerian descriptions of Dilmun. Trade goods from the Indus Valley pass through Bahrain to reach Mesopotamia, making the island a crucial commercial link. But whether this real place was the inspiration for the mythological paradise, or whether the myth simply borrowed a familiar name for its sacred geography, remains unclear. What's more significant is Dilmun's role in the flood narratives. After the waters recede, after Ziusudra survives in his boat and makes offering to the gods, the Anunnaki grant him eternal life and transport him to Dilmun. He's removed from normal geography, taken beyond the reach of death, placed in the one location that exists outside the natural order. This makes Ziusudra a bridge between ages, a preserved fragment of the antediluvian world living forever in the paradise that remembers what existence was like before the Anunnaki fully imposed cosmic law. The Epic of Gilgamesh much later sends its heroes searching for Ziusudra. They're called Utnapishtim, to learn the secret of immortality. Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death, reaches the far shore where Dilmun exists, and finds the flood survivor still living, still remembering the world before. But Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that immortality isn't available anymore, that the conditions that allowed the Anunnaki to grant such gifts have passed, that the world now operates under different rules, stricter boundaries between mortal and divine. Dilmun represents what are lost in the transition from the antediluvian age to the world we inhabit, a place where death didn't exist, where suffering was unknown, where gods and the worthy among humans could dwell together without the separation that later became absolute. The tablets describe it with longing, as something humanity once had access to, but that now exists only as myth, as memory, as a paradise preserved beyond geography, where the last survivor of the old world lives eternally, remembering what we've forgotten. Quote 28. One of the most complete Sumerian myths describes the goddess Inanna's journey to the underworld, where she encounters the Anunnaki in their role as judges of the dead. The tablet is explicit. 7 Anunnaki sit in judgment, fastening their eyes upon her eyes of death. They speak the word of condemnation, and Inanna dies, hung upon a hook like a piece of meat. The underworld, in Sumerian conception, wasn't hell in the Christian sense. It was the realm beneath, where all humans eventually went, and where the Anunnaki held court. But the tablets hint at something older. Before the current cosmic order, before the separation of heaven and earth, the Anunnaki moved freely between realms. The underworld texts describe a time when boundaries were more permeable, when gods could die and be resurrected, when the natural laws we take for granted hadn't fully solidified. Inanna's resurrection, achieved through trickery and divine intervention, suggests the Anunnaki's powers were in some sense greater before, when the cosmos was younger and more flexible. The myth begins with Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, deciding to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral of her sister's husband. This is presented as dangerous from the start, a journey from which gods don't reliably return. But Inanna is ambitious, proud, perhaps seeking to extend her power even into the realm of the dead. She dresses in her full divine regalia. The crown, the lapis lazuli necklace, the breastplate, the gold bracelet, the measuring rod and line that symbolize her authority, and the royal robe. She is divinity made visible, power adorned. At the first gate of the underworld, the gatekeeper stops her. He allows passage only if she removes her crown. At the second gate, she must remove her necklace. At the third, her breastplate. Gate by gate, 7 gates total, Inanna is stripped of her divine power, her protective garments, until she enters the throne room of the underworld naked and powerless, no different from any human soul that makes this final journey. There, in the throne room, sit the 7 Anunnaki judges. The tablet names them as divine arbiters, ancient gods whose role is to determine fate, particularly the fate of those who enter the land of no return. They fix their eyes on Inanna, eyes described as eyes of death, gazes that carry the power to end existence. They speak, and their word is judgment, condemnation, death sentence pronounced on the goddess who dared enter their realm. Inanna dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook, left to rot. The Queen of Heaven, one of the most powerful Anunnaki, is reduced to dead meat, demonstration that in the underworld, different gods hold authority, different rules apply. The boundaries that protect divine existence in the world above don't extend below. Death claims even goddesses who descend to its domain. But Inanna had prepared. Before her descent, she instructed her minister Ninshubur to seek help if she didn't return. After 3 days and 3 nights, when Inanna doesn't emerge, Ninshubur goes to the great gods pleading for intervention. Enlil refuses. Nanna refuses. But Enki, always sympathetic, always clever, creates 2 beings from the dirt under his fingernails, creatures neither alive nor dead, who can enter the underworld without triggering its laws. He gives them the food and water of life, and sends them to rescue Inanna. They descend, find Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. Groaning in pain as if giving birth, they sympathize with her, speak kindly, and she, grateful for compassion, offers them a gift. They ask for Inanna's corpse, and Ereshkigal, bound by her word, releases it. The creatures sprinkle the food and water of life upon the dead goddess, and Inanna returns to life, begins her ascent back to the world above. But the underworld demands balance. Someone must take Inanna's place. The demons accompanying her search for a substitute, rejecting those who mourned her absence but seizing upon Dumuzi, her husband, who didn't mourn but instead sat on her throne assuming power. They drag him below, and the tablet describes his terror, his attempts to flee, his eventual capture and descent to replace Inanna as the underworld's prisoner. What this myth reveals about the Anunnaki is profound. They exist in multiple realms, holding different authorities in different domains. In heaven, Inanna is powerful. In the underworld, the 7 judges are supreme. The boundaries between these realms are real, enforced by laws that even gods must obey. When Inanna enters the underworld, she becomes subject to its rules, stripped of her power, vulnerable to judgment and death. But the myth also suggests these boundaries weren't always so rigid. The fact that Inanna can be resurrected, that beings created by Enki can move between realms, that substitution is possible, implies flexibility in cosmic law, loopholes and exceptions that suggest the current order is maintained by constant effort rather than being absolutely fixed. Earlier versions of descent myths, fragments from the Sumerian Old Babylonian period, describe even freer movement between realms, gods ascending and descending according to seasonal cycles, boundaries that opened and closed rather than remaining permanently sealed. The tablets hint that in the time before the Anunnaki fully organized the cosmos, the separation between life and death, heaven and underworld, mortal and divine, was less absolute. Inanna's story preserves memory of that older, more fluid reality, while describing the current system where boundaries exist, where realms are separated, where even gods must obey the laws of the domain they enter. The Anunnaki maintain this order through their role as judges, as enforcers of cosmic law, as beings who sit in the deepest parts of reality and determine fates that even other gods cannot escape. Among the thousands of tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites, many contain purely mathematical content, and the sophistication is startling. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian knowledge, used a base 60 number system, calculated square roots to remarkable accuracy, understood the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras, and created astronomical tables requiring advanced algebra. The Plimpton 322 tablet, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains Pythagorean triples that suggest understanding of mathematical principles far beyond what survival and basic architecture would require. Where did this knowledge come from? The tablets themselves offer an answer that modern scholarship finds uncomfortable. It was taught by the Anunnaki. Text after text credits divine instruction for human understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Whether this is metaphorical, a way of expressing that knowledge felt mysterious and powerful, or whether it preserves some memory of rapid knowledge transfer remains an open question. But the sophistication appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear precursors, as if civilization didn't gradually develop mathematical understanding but inherited it largely complete. The Plimpton 322 tablet sits in Columbia University's collection, a small clay tablet about 13 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters tall, its right edge broken away sometime in antiquity. What remains is a table of numbers, 4 columns of cuneiform numerals arranged in 15 rows. For decades after its acquisition in the 1920s, scholars debated what these numbers meant. Then mathematicians realized they were looking at Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the fundamental relationship in right triangles. But this tablet predates Pythagoras by over 1,000 years. And it's not just listing obvious examples. The triples are sophisticated, some involving numbers in the thousands, suggesting whoever compiled this table understood the underlying mathematical principles well enough to generate examples systematically. This wasn't trial and error. This was mathematical knowledge applied with precision and purpose. The base 60-number system the Mesopotamians used adds another layer of sophistication. We still use remnants of it today when we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. But sexagesimal arithmetic is complex, requiring memorization of multiplication tables far more extensive than our base 10 system. Yet tablets from scribal schools show young students mastering these tables, calculating with numbers in the hundreds of thousands, performing operations that modern students would struggle with even using calculators. Mathematical tablets cover an astonishing range. There are tables of reciprocals, allowing division through multiplication. There are square root approximations accurate to several decimal places. There are solutions to quadratic equations. There are geometric problems calculating areas of irregular fields, volumes of truncated pyramids, dimensions of canals and embankments. The mathematics serves practical purposes like architecture, surveying, and administration. But the sophistication extends far beyond what mere practicality would require. Where did this knowledge originate? Modern mathematics education assumes gradual development, simple arithmetic leading to more complex operations, basic geometry expanding into advanced theorems. But the Mesopotamian mathematical tablets don't show this progression. The earliest examples already demonstrate sophisticated understanding. By the time of the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 BCE, mathematical texts treat complex problems as routine exercises for students, suggesting the foundational knowledge was already ancient, already established, being copied and taught rather than discovered and developed. And the tablets themselves attribute this knowledge to divine teaching. Multiple texts describe Enki, god of wisdom, as the source of mathematical understanding. Others credit Nisaba, goddess of grain and writing, with revealing the secrets of numbers. The Sumerians didn't claim to have invented mathematics through human experimentation. They said the Anunnaki taught them that numerical knowledge was part of the me, the divine principles that made civilization possible. Modern scholars typically interpret this as myth-making, humans attributing their own discoveries to divine authority to invest them with sacred significance. But the alternative interpretation, the one the tablets themselves support, is more uncomfortable. What if the mathematical knowledge was transmitted rather than discovered, taught by a source that already possessed it rather than gradually developed through generations of trial and error? The sophistication combined with the apparent suddenness creates a puzzle. Mathematical understanding doesn't appear to evolve in the archaeological record. It appears already formed, already sophisticated, in the earliest texts that discuss numerical concepts. The progression visible in tablets isn't from simple to complex mathematics, but from mathematical understanding to mathematical application, as if the principles were known, and what developed was finding new uses for knowledge that already existed. Whether this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, from an earlier civilization whose records are lost, from particularly brilliant individuals whose names are forgotten, or from gradual development that left no archaeological trace, the tablets preserve a consistent story. Mathematics was taught, not invented, and the beings who taught it, according to every text that addresses the question, were the same beings who taught writing, metallurgy, agriculture, and all the other arts that separated Sumerian civilization from the wilderness that surrounded it. When Leonard Woolley excavated Ur in the 1920s, he found something that shouldn't exist: a layer of clean river clay, 11 feet thick, separating earlier occupation levels from later ones. No artifacts, no pottery, just sterile flood deposit. He called it evidence of the biblical flood. Later excavations at other sites found similar discontinuous layers, though not always at the same depth or date, suggesting multiple local floods rather than one universal catastrophe. But here's what makes the Sumerian tablets remarkable. They describe a world before the flood that was fundamentally different, not just in terms of divine-human relations, but in basic facts about reality. Lifespans were longer. The gods were more present. Knowledge was more direct. After the flood, according to these texts, the Anunnaki withdrew somewhat, maintaining temples but no longer walking among humans as they once had. The flood layer in archaeology might be mundane sediment from river flooding, but in Sumerian mythology, it marks the boundary between ages, between the world as the Anunnaki first made it and the world as we inherited it. Woolley's excavation at Ur was methodical, careful, proceeding level by level down through accumulated debris of millennia. He found pottery from the Ubaid period, simple vessels from Mesopotamia's earlier settled culture. He found the remains of houses, fire pits, tools. Then, beneath these occupation layers, his workers encountered something unexpected. Pure clay, water-laid sediment, thick and sterile, containing nothing human, nothing cultural, just the kind of deposit a massive flood would leave. He measured it carefully. Over 3 meters thick in some places. This layer of clean clay separated the earlier Ubaid settlement from later occupation. Woolley was convinced he'd found evidence of the biblical deluge, the flood that Noah survived, the catastrophe described in Genesis. He published his findings with that interpretation, claiming archaeology had confirmed scripture. But as other sites were excavated, the picture became more complicated. Similar flood layers appeared at other locations, but not at the same stratigraphic level, not dating to the same period. The flood Woolley found at Ur dated to different centuries than flood layers at Kish or Shurupak. What seemed like evidence of one universal catastrophe began looking more like evidence of multiple local floods, the kind that would be expected in a region where major rivers periodically overflow their banks and inundate the surrounding plains. Yet the Sumerian tablets insisted there was one flood, one catastrophe that reset civilization, one divine decision to destroy humanity that shaped all subsequent history. The king list divides time into before and after the flood. The Atrahasis epic and Eridu Genesis describe it as a singular event, not a series of local inundations. The tablets speak of water covering the earth, of all humanity being destroyed except the one family that survived through divine warning. Modern scholarship generally reconciles this by suggesting the tablets preserve cultural memory of particularly devastating floods, perhaps multiple catastrophes compressed in oral tradition into one great deluge, mythologized and expanded until it became the cosmic reset described in the epics. The flood happened, in this interpretation, but not quite as the tablets describe it, and its significance was theological rather than literal. But what's remarkable is what the tablets say changed after the flood. This wasn't just water damage and reconstruction. According to Sumerian texts, the antediluvian world operated under different rules. The kingless pre-diluvian rulers lived for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans shortened dramatically, approaching and then reaching normal human ranges. Something about reality itself had changed. The tablets described the Anunnaki as more present before the flood, walking among humans, teaching directly, maintaining closer contact between divine and mortal realms. After the waters receded, the gods withdrew to their temples, descending for specific rituals and festivals, but no longer dwelling continuously on earth, as they had in the earlier age. The separation between heaven and earth became more pronounced. Boundaries that had been permeable became fixed. Knowledge transmission changed too. Before the flood, according to texts like the astronomical tablets that reference understanding was more direct, less mediated. After, knowledge had to be preserved in writing, copied carefully from tablet to tablet because the direct divine instruction that had characterized the earlier age was no longer available. The me that Enki had dispensed freely before the flood became precious artifacts after, carefully guarded in temples, transferred with ritual and ceremony rather than given casually. The flood layer woolly found might have been just river sediment from periodic inundation. But in Sumerian understanding, it marked the boundary between worlds, between the age when the Anunnaki established civilization and walked among their creation, and the age when humanity was left largely to maintain what had been taught, to preserve through writing and tradition the knowledge that had once flowed more freely from divine sources. Whether this is history or theology, whether the tablets describe an actual transformation in how reality functioned, or simply how humans experienced and understood their relationship to the divine, the consistency is striking. Text after text describes the flood as a reset, a break, the end of one world and the beginning of another. And archaeology, whatever its evidence of local floods and gradual cultural evolution, cannot entirely dismiss the possibility that something significant changed, that some boundary was crossed, that the world after was genuinely different from the world before in ways that river sediment and pottery sequences can't fully capture. Across multiple versions of the flood story, one element remains consistent: Enki's rebellion against the Anunnaki Council's decision to destroy humanity. In the Atrahasis epic, Enlil and the other gods decree annihilation because human noise disturbs their rest. But Enki, who participated in humanity's creation, warns the mortal Atrahasis by speaking to the reed wall of his house, technically not violating the oath of secrecy the gods swore to each other. This act of divine disobedience fascinates scholars because it reveals tension within the Anunnaki themselves, disagreement about humanity's purpose and value. Enki is consistently portrayed as humanity's advocate, the god who gave the me of civilization, who taught agriculture and writing, who preserved survivors through the catastrophe. The tablets suggest that without Enki's intervention, the reset would have been total. The world after the flood would have been empty of humans. Instead, he ensured continuity, and the Anunnaki reluctantly accepted humanity's survival, but under new terms, new limitations, new boundaries between mortal and divine. The tension between Enki and Enlil runs through Mesopotamian mythology like a fault line. Two brothers with fundamentally different views about humanity's place in the cosmic order. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, chief of the Anunnaki Council, represented divine authority and cosmic law. When humans became troublesome, exceeded their purpose, disturbed the peace the gods required, Enlil's response was consistent: reduce them, control them, if necessary, destroy them completely. But Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom, held a different position. He had participated in humanity's creation, mixing clay with divine blood, giving us consciousness and capability. He had taught the arts of civilization, dispensed the me, established Eridu as the place where divine knowledge would be transmitted to mortal recipients. He was invested in humanity's success in ways Enlil was not. The flood story brings this tension to its breaking point. The Anunnaki Council has decided humanity must be destroyed. The noise, the chaos, the multiplication beyond intended limits, all of it has become intolerable. Enlil demands total annihilation, and the other gods, exhausted by human disruption, agree. They swear an oath to each other. No one will warn humanity. No one will sabotage the plan. The flood will come without warning, and humanity will be swept away completely. Enki swears the oath. He has no choice. To refuse would be to openly rebel against the council's decision, to place himself in opposition to divine authority itself. But the oath doesn't prevent him from acting. It only prevents him from directly warning a human. So he finds a loophole, a technicality that preserves the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. He goes to the house of Atrahasis, in some versions called Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, the man known for piety and wisdom. But instead of speaking to the man, Enki addresses the reed wall of his house. Quote 30, the tablet records him saying, he describes the flood, the decision of the gods, the coming catastrophe. He never speaks directly to Atrahasis. He speaks to the wall, but Atrahasis, of course, hears everything. This act of divine disobedience is extraordinary because it reveals something crucial about the Anunnaki. They were not unanimous, not unified in purpose, not simply executing cosmic law without disagreement or doubt. They had factions, competing interests, different values and priorities. Enki valued humanity, saw potential in these beings made from clay and divine blood, believed we deserved preservation despite our flaws. Enlil saw only disruption, noise, chaos that needed to be eliminated. The text makes clear that without Enki's warning, the flood would have succeeded completely. No humans would have survived. The boat wouldn't have been built. The animals and grain wouldn't have been preserved. The world after the flood would have been silent, empty of human voices, returned to the state before humanity's creation. The Anunnaki would have been alone again, and if they wanted workers, they would have had to create a new species, perhaps one more compliant, less capable of multiplication and disruption. But Enki ensured continuity. Atrahasis built the boat according to divine instructions. He survived the 7 days and nights of rain, the storm god's fury, the waters that covered the earth. And when the flood receded, when Enlil discovered that humans had survived, that Enki had thwarted the council's will, the tension exploded into open conflict. The tablets describe Enlil's rage, his demand to know which god had violated the oath. Enki admits what he's done but argues for mercy. Humanity has been reduced, he points out. The noise has been eliminated. The excessive population has been culled. Perhaps total destruction was never necessary. Perhaps a warning, a reduction, a reset short of complete annihilation was sufficient. And remarkably, the council accepts this argument. They grant Atrahasis and his family eternal life, transport them to Dilmun, and allow humanity to repopulate the earth. But under new conditions, new limitations. Women will have more difficulty in childbirth, reducing population growth. Some women will be barren. Death will take children as well as adults. The easy multiplication that characterized the antediluvian age will be constrained, controlled, kept within limits the gods find tolerable. Enki's disobedience saved humanity, but it also changed the terms of our existence. We survived, but diminished, living under stricter boundaries, more distant from divine presence, no longer multiplying as freely, no longer hearing God speak except through carefully mediated rituals and priesthoods. The world after the flood was a world where Enki's advocacy had preserved us, but couldn't restore what had been lost, where divine favour had been conditional and remained conditional, where humanity existed at the sufferance of beings who had proven willing to destroy us, and might make that choice again if we exceeded the new limits they had imposed. The concept of me appears throughout Sumerian literature but resists easy translation. More than laws, deeper than customs, the me were fundamental principles that made civilization function. In Inanna and Enki, the goddess tricks Enki while he's drunk, stealing over 100 me from him and bringing them to her city Uruk. The tablet lists them: lordship, godship, the crown, the throne, kingship, priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, craft of the smith, craft of the leather worker, craft of the builder, craft of the weaver, wisdom, understanding, the art of lovemaking, the art of war. Each me was discrete, transferable, teachable. Together they constituted everything that separated civilization from wilderness. The implication is profound. Before the Anunnaki dispensed the me, these principles didn't exist in human society. Metallurgy wasn't discovered, it was given. Writing wasn't invented, it was taught. The tablets preserve a worldview where civilization isn't humanity's achievement, but a gift, or perhaps a burden, bestowed by beings who possessed this knowledge from the beginning. The story of Inanna stealing the me reveals how the Sumerians understood cultural transmission and the nature of civilization itself. Inanna, ambitious goddess of Uruk, decides her city needs the divine principles that make greatness possible. These me are stored in Eridu, in Enki's temple, the Abzu, the sacred structure built over the underground fresh water that Enki controls. So Inanna travels south from Uruk to visit Enki, ostensibly paying respects but actually planning theft. Enki receives her warmly, perhaps too warmly. He orders a feast prepared, beer served, celebration of Inanna's visit. And as the beer flows, as Enki becomes intoxicated, he grows generous, offering gifts to his divine visitor. One by one he gives her the me, and one by one she accepts them, and has her minister, Ninshubur, load them onto the boat of heaven for transport back to Uruk. The list the tablet preserves is fascinating in its comprehensiveness and its strange juxtapositions. Kingship and prostitution, heroship and falsehood, musical instruments and weapons of war, fear and victory, straightforwardness and deceit. The me encompass everything that makes civilization complex, containing within itself both creative and destructive potentials, both virtues and vices, both order and chaos. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done. He calls his minister Izamud and demands the me be retrieved. Izamud sends demons to pursue Inanna's boat, to intercept her before she reaches Uruk and claim the me back for Eridu. The tablet describes multiple attempts, demons catching up to Inanna at different points along her journey, demanding she return what Enki gave in drunkenness. But Inanna refuses. Enki gave the me freely, she argues. They were gifts, not loans, and Ninshubur, her minister, uses magic to repel the demons, to protect the me until Inanna reaches Uruk's gates. Once she brings them within her city, Once they're deposited in her temple, they're beyond Enki's reach. Eridu has lost them. Uruk has gained them, and the city that was young and relatively unimportant becomes great through acquisition of these divine principles. What this myth reveals is that the me were understood as transferable, teachable, capable of being moved from one location to another, from divine possession to human use. They weren't abstract concepts, they were concrete principles, almost like technology or recipes, specific knowledge that allowed specific civilizational functions. Before Uruk received the me from Inanna, it lacked the principles needed for full civilization. After she brought them, the city could develop metallurgy, establish kingship, create art, organize priesthoods, conduct warfare. The me made the difference between a settlement and a city, between scattered people and organized civilization. But the deeper implication is what this says about civilization's origin. If the me were divine possessions that had to be given to or stolen by humanity, then civilization didn't develop naturally from human ingenuity. It required transmission from beings who already possessed the relevant knowledge. Humans couldn't invent metallurgy because the principle of working metal was a me, a divine law or cosmic principle that existed in divine realm before being transferred to mortal application. This is radically different from how modern culture understands technological and social development. We assume humans discovered fire, invented tools, developed agriculture, created writing through experimentation and innovation. But Sumerian texts describe all of these as me, divine principles that were taught, given, transmitted from the Anunnaki who possessed them to humans who received them. The tablets don't celebrate human achievement. They celebrate divine generosity or describe divine conflict over whether humans deserve access to this knowledge. Enki is praised for giving the me, for teaching humanity, for raising us from animal-like existence to civilized life. But the text never suggests humans could have achieved this without him. Without the me, without divine instruction, humans would have remained primitive, incapable of building cities, creating art, organizing complex societies. Whether this is historical memory of some actual knowledge transmission, whether it's mythological explanation for why humans have capabilities other animals lack, or whether it preserves some truth that our modern framework doesn't allow us to comprehend, the Sumerian texts are consistent. Civilization came from outside, from above, from the Anunnaki who possessed the me before humans existed, and who chose, for reasons divine politics made complex, to share that knowledge with the beings they had created to serve them. The archaeological record of early Sumer creates a puzzle that scholars still debate. Around 3500 BCE, in the span of just a few centuries, villages became cities, simple tokens became writing, basic pottery became sophisticated art, and isolated settlements became a complex civilization with long-distance trade, monumental architecture, and administrative bureaucracy. This rapidity is unusual. Most civilizations show gradual development over millennia, yet Sumer seems to accelerate suddenly, and the Sumerians themselves credited this transformation to the Anunnaki. Modern archaeology seeks natural explanations. Agricultural surplus allowed specialization, river management required coordination, trade created complexity, all true. But the speed remains remarkable, and the absence of clear precursors for some technologies, particularly writing and mathematics, continues to puzzle researchers. The tablets consistently describe a time before writing when knowledge was oral, before cities when humans lived scattered, before organization when chaos prevailed. Then the Anunnaki descended, and everything changed. Mythology or racial memory, metaphor or history. The question hangs over every excavation, every translated tablet. The Uruk period, named for the city that epitomized this transformation, represents one of the most dramatic accelerations in human history. Within perhaps 300 years, between roughly 3500 and 3200 BCE, settlements that had remained relatively simple for millennia suddenly exploded in size and complexity. Uruk itself grew to over 250 hectares, with population estimates reaching 40,000 or more, making it easily the largest city on Earth at that time. Monumental architecture appeared during this period. The White Temple at Uruk, built on a massive platform that required organization of labor on unprecedented scale, demonstrated engineering capabilities that seemed to emerge fully formed. The craftsmanship was sophisticated from the beginning, not showing the trial and error one might expect if this was humanity's first attempt at monumental building. Writing appeared during this same narrow window, developing from simple tokens and seal impressions to full, cuneiform script within a century or two. The speed of this development puzzles linguists. Writing systems typically evolve slowly, pictographs gradually becoming more abstract, meaning gradually separating from specific objects to represent sounds and ideas. But Sumerian writing seems to accelerate through stages that should take much longer, as if guided by understanding of where the system was headed rather than stumbling toward it through experiment. The cylinder seal, a uniquely Mesopotamian invention, appeared in sophisticated form almost immediately. These small stone cylinders, carved with intricate designs that would create impressions when rolled across wet clay, required advanced lapidary skills and understanding of negative relief. Yet the earliest examples show mastery of the technique, detailed scenes of gods and kings, animals and rituals, carved with precision that suggests the craft was already well developed, rather than just being invented. Long-distance trade networks expanded dramatically during the Uruk period, reaching Iran for lapis lazuli, Anatolia for obsidian, the Gulf for shells and precious stones. This wasn't simple barter between neighbours. This was organised commerce requiring record-keeping, standardised measures, and coordination across vast distances. The administrative bureaucracy needed to manage such trade appeared simultaneously with the trade itself, as if the organisational principles were understood before being implemented rather than discovered through the chaos of attempting to manage complexity without preparation. Standard pottery forms spread across Mesopotamia. Mass-produced vessels that show remarkable uniformity. This implies both specialization, potters whose entire occupation was making vessels, and distribution networks that could move goods efficiently between cities and settlements. The economic complexity this requires, the division of labor, the coordination of production and distribution, all of it appears in the archaeological record suddenly. Within just a few generations, modern explanations for this rapid development focus on environmental and social factors. The Ubaid period before had seen population growth and agricultural intensification. Climate changes may have created pressures requiring new forms of organization. Competition between communities may have driven innovation and expansion. River management in southern Mesopotamia required coordination. And this coordination may have catalyzed development of the administrative tools and social hierarchies that characterize urban civilization. All of these factors certainly played roles. Civilizations don't emerge from nothing. Environmental context, population dynamics, economic pressures, all contribute to cultural development. But the speed remains unusual. the apparent lack of intermediate stages for crucial technologies like writing and advanced mathematics remains puzzling. The sophistication visible in the earliest examples of monumental architecture, art, and administration suggests knowledge rather than experimentation, implementation of principles already understood rather than gradual discovery through trial and error. And the Sumerians themselves explained this acceleration quite clearly. The Anunnaki taught them. Enki gave the me of civilization. The gods descended and organized human society according to divine principles. Writing was taught by Nisaba. Mathematics was revealed by Enki. Architecture was guided by divine instruction. The tablets don't describe humans slowly figuring things out. They describe gods sharing knowledge, teaching, transmitting understanding that transformed scattered humans into civilized city dwellers capable of creating the first great urban culture in human history. Whether this is myth-making, humans attributing their own achievements to divine sources to invest them with sacred authority, or whether it preserves some memory of actual knowledge transmission, perhaps from an earlier culture now lost, perhaps from some source we can't identify, the archaeological reality remains. Civilization appeared in Sumer with remarkable speed, sophisticated from its earliest expressions, as if something fundamental changed around 3500 BCE. Some boundary was crossed, some knowledge was acquired or transmitted that made everything that followed possible in ways that everything before had not been. Every major Sumerian city built a ziggurat, massive stepped pyramids that dominated the landscape. The ziggurat of Ur, partially reconstructed, still rises over 60 feet. Originally it would have been higher, topped with a shrine accessible only to priests. The Babylonian ziggurat Etemenanki, temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, likely inspired the biblical Tower of Babel story. But here's what the tablets say about their purpose. Ziggurats were landing places, way stations between heaven and earth, where the Anunnaki could descend and humans could ascend for ritual contact. The very architecture of Mesopotamian civilization was designed to facilitate communication between realms. Each ziggurat was called the quote 33 quote, and tablets describe elaborate rituals where priests would climb to the summit, enter the shrine, and in darkness await the god's arrival. Whether this arrival was literal, spiritual, or psychological, the Sumerians built their holier structures around the belief that the Anunnaki needed these intermediary spaces, these artificial mountains that brought Earth closer to sky. After the flood, perhaps the gods couldn't or wouldn't descend as freely. The ziggurats were humanity's attempt to meet them halfway. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, though it likely stood on the foundations of earlier structures. When Leonard Woolley excavated it in the 1920s, he found a massive platform rising in 3 stages, each smaller than the one below, creating the stepped pyramid form that characterizes all ziggurats. The outer walls weren't vertical but slightly curved, bulging outward, an architectural sophistication that created optical illusions, making the structure appear even more massive than it was. 3 staircases, each containing 100 steps, converged at a gateway leading to the 2nd level. From there, another staircase climbed to the 3rd level, and finally to the shrine at the summit, a small sacred room where only the highest priest could enter. The entire structure was oriented to cardinal directions with precision that required sophisticated surveying knowledge. This wasn't primitive construction. This was planned, calculated, executed according to principles that treated the building as a cosmic diagram, an architectural representation of the connection between earth and heaven. The name, quote, 3-4 comes from the Akkadian word meaning, quote, 3-5, but the Sumerian term was more revealing, quote, 3-6 temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. This wasn't metaphorical language. The Sumerians believed these structures literally connected realms, providing physical locations where boundaries between earth and sky became permeable, where the Anunnaki could descend without fully leaving their divine realm, where humans could ascend without dying and entering the underworld. Tablets describe the ritual that occurred at these summit shrines. At specific times during particular festivals, the high priest would climb the ziggurat steps, enter the shrine at the top, and wait in darkness for the god to arrive. What happened in that darkness? The tablets don't always specify. Some texts suggest divine communication, the god speaking to the priest, conveying instructions or prophecies. Other texts hint at something more physical, actual presence, the god manifesting in the shrine for the duration of the ritual. The ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, was the largest ever built, rising approximately 300 feet according to ancient descriptions. Though it's been destroyed and eroded until almost nothing remains, ancient accounts describe it as visible from vast distances across the Mesopotamian plain, a mountain where no mountain should exist, proclaiming Babylon's status as the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth most closely connected. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel likely draws on memory of Etemenanki and the tradition of ziggurat construction, but the biblical interpretation reverses the meaning. In Genesis, the tower is human pride, an attempt to reach heaven uninvited, which God punishes by confusing languages. In Sumerian understanding, ziggurats were divine instruction, structures the Anunnaki wanted built, architectural solutions to the problem of communication between separated realms. Because that was the key purpose. After the flood, after the Anunnaki withdrew somewhat from direct contact, these artificial mountains allowed continued interaction. The gods couldn't or wouldn't descend to ordinary earth as freely as they had in the antediluvian age, but they would descend to the ziggurat summits, meeting humanity at these elevated points, maintaining connection while preserving the new boundaries that had been established after the catastrophe that reset the world. Every ziggurat had a temple at its base as well as the shrine at its summit. The earthly temple was where daily rituals occurred, where offerings were made, where priests maintained the god's earthly household. But the summit shrine was different, special, the actual meeting place where divine and human could encounter each other directly without the mediation that characterized most religious practice. The construction of these massive structures required enormous resources, thousands of workers, millions of mud bricks, careful planning and execution over years or decades, yet city after city built them, investing wealth and labor into these artificial mountains. The commitment reveals how important the Sumerians considered maintaining this connection, how essential they believed it was to have these physical locations where the separation between earth and heaven could be temporarily bridged. Modern archaeologists interpret ziggurats as religious architecture. Temples designed to elevate worship literally and symbolically, to create impressive monuments that demonstrated a city's devotion and wealth. All true. But the tablets suggest the Sumerians understood them more literally, as functional structures serving actual purpose, allowing continued contact with the Anunnaki, who had descended in the time before, who had walked among humans more freely, who now required these intermediary spaces, these mountains built by human hands to bring Earth closer to the sky from which the gods had come and to which they had largely returned. No single tablet tells the complete story of the Anunnaki and the world they created. Instead, the narrative exists in fragments, scattered across thousands of tablets from different cities and time periods. Some texts contradict others. Some deities play different roles in different versions. But in the early 2000s, certain scholars, most notably Samuel Kramer and later researchers, attempted to compile these fragments into coherent narratives. The result shows a consistent framework, a time before the flood when Anunnaki and humans interacted directly, when divine beings performed labor that later fell to mortals, when lifespans extended for millennia, and when knowledge flowed more freely between realms. Then came catastrophe, either deserved or not depending on the text, survival through divine mercy. And afterwards, a renegotiated reality where gods withdrew to temples and heavens, humans multiplied across the earth, and the intimacy of the earlier age became memory, myth, and sacred text. Whether this framework represents historical events, cultural evolution myths, or something between, every tablet contributes pieces to a puzzle that will never be fully complete. The fragmentation is both frustrating and revealing. Frustrating because we'll never have the complete narrative, never read the full account of the Anunnaki and their interaction with early humanity as a single coherent text. But revealing because the very fragmentation shows how consistent the core mythology remained across different cities, different time periods, different political regimes. When tablets from Nippur agree with tablets from Ur, when Sumerian texts align with later Akkadian versions, when myths separated by 1,000 years preserve the same basic framework, it suggests cultural memory rather than individual invention, traditions maintained across generations rather than stories created and discarded. Kramer spent decades piecing together these fragments, identifying which broken tablets belong to the same original text, filling gaps by comparing multiple versions, reconstructing narratives from pieces scattered across museum collections worldwide. His work revealed patterns. Creation myths from different cities all described the Anunnaki organizing chaos into order. Flood stories from different periods all featured Enki warning humanity against the other gods' decision to destroy. King lists from different archives all divided time into before and after the flood, with dramatically different characteristics in each age. The contradictions, when they appear, are usually in details rather than framework. One text might say 7 Anunnaki served as judges, another might say 50. One version might emphasize Enlil's role, another might focus on Enki. But the basic structure remains stable. The Anunnaki existed before humanity, created us for specific purpose, taught us civilization, withdrew somewhat after the flood, and continued to govern cosmic order while humans maintained the civilization the gods had established. What emerges from this compilation is something like a consensus mythology, not in the sense that every Sumerian believed exactly the same thing, but in the sense that certain core beliefs pervaded Mesopotamian culture across millennia. The Anunnaki were real. They had organized the world from chaos. They had created humanity. They had taught civilization. A catastrophic flood had reset everything. The world after operated under different rules than the world before. Scholars attempting to reconstruct these narratives face constant challenges. Should contradictory accounts be harmonized or preserved as alternatives? When a tablet breaks, off mid-sentence, is it appropriate to fill the gap from other versions or leave it incomplete? How much weight should be given to later Babylonian and Assyrian versions when trying to understand original Sumerian beliefs? These methodological questions have no perfect answers, and different scholars make different choices, resulting in different reconstructions. But what's remarkable is how much agreement exists despite these challenges. The antediluvian world was different from the post-diluvian world. The Anunnaki were more present, more involved before the flood. Knowledge was more direct, less mediated. Lifespans were longer. Divine and human realms were less separated. Then came catastrophe, survival through divine mercy, and a new age where boundaries were firmer, where the intimacy of the earlier time became something remembered rather than experienced. Whether this framework describes actual historical transformation, whether it's mythological explanation for cultural evolution, whether it preserves racial memory of some real change in how humans related to whatever they experienced as divine, the consistency across fragments is striking. These weren't individual authors creating personal visions. These were scribes copying ancient traditions, priests maintaining sacred narratives, cultures preserving foundational myths that explain their origins and their relationship to forces greater than themselves. The Lost Book of Enki doesn't exist, not as a single coherent document, but it exists in fragments, pieces scattered across time and space, preserved in clay that has survived millennia. And those fragments, when assembled carefully, when read with attention to both consistency and contradiction, reveal a civilization that understood itself as inheritor rather than inventor, taught rather than self-taught, recipient of knowledge that had been given by beings who had possessed it before humanity existed, and who had chosen, for complex reasons involving divine politics and cosmic necessity, to share enough of that knowledge to make civilization possible. Reading the tablets carefully, avoiding both uncritical acceptance and reflexive dismissal, reveals what the Sumerians actually believed the Anunnaki controlled. Enlil governed wind and storm, and when angered could send devastating weather. Enki commanded fresh water, springs and underground aquifers, critical for irrigation in a desert climate. Inanna ruled fertility, both agricultural and human, and her favour or displeasure directly affected crop yields and childbirth. Utu controlled the sun's path, determining day and night. The Anunnaki weren't distant abstractions. They were the forces that made or destroyed Sumerian life. Flooding rivers, scorching summers, failed harvests, disease, warfare. And the tablets describe a time before the Anunnaki organized these forces into predictable patterns. Before Enlil separated heaven from earth, chaos reigned. Before Enki established river boundaries, water and land mixed indiscriminately. Before Utu received his cosmic assignment, the sun wandered irregularly. The world before wasn't primitive, it was unformed, and the Anunnaki's primary achievement, according to these texts, was imposing order on chaos, creating the natural laws that allowed civilization to emerge and survive. This is crucial for understanding what the Sumerians actually meant when they spoke of the Anunnaki creating the world. They weren't describing creation from nothing, the way Genesis describes God speaking reality into existence. They were describing organization, the imposition of pattern on chaos, the establishment of reliable natural law that replaced unpredictable, dangerous disorder. In the Enuma Elish, before the gods organize the cosmos, there is only the mingling of Apsu and Tiamat, fresh water and salt water mixing without boundary. From this formlessness, gods emerge, and eventually those gods fight, kill the primordial parents, and from their bodies create ordered reality. Sky separated from earth, stars positioned in fixed paths, seasons established, rivers given specific courses, day and night made predictable. Enlil's specific role was separating heaven from earth, establishing the boundary between divine and mortal realms. Before this separation, the tablets suggest, the two realms mingled more freely. Gods and mortals occupied the same space without clear division. But Enlil's decree established firmament, created the space between, made heaven and earth distinct domains. This wasn't cruel separation necessarily, it was order imposed on chaos, the creation of structure where previously there had been only confused mingling. Enki's domain was water, both the Abzu beneath the earth and the rivers that flowed across it. His achievement was giving these waters boundaries, making them flow in predictable channels rather than spreading chaotically. The Tigris and Euphrates, the lifeblood of Mesopotamian civilization, were Enki's creation in the sense that he established their courses, defined their banks, made them reliable sources of irrigation and transportation, rather than uncontrolled forces of destruction. But the tablets make clear, these waters wanted to overflow, wanted to return to chaos. Every year, the spring floods threatened to wash away boundaries, to return land to water, to undo the order Enki had established. Only through constant divine attention, through rituals that renewed Enki's decree, through maintenance of the cosmic law he had imposed, could the rivers be kept within their bounds. Civilization existed in constant tension with the chaos that preceded it and that still threatened at its edges. Inanna's control over fertility operated similarly. Before her organization of these forces, the tablets suggest fertility was random, unpredictable, sometimes excessive and sometimes completely absent. Inanna established patterns, planting and harvest, conception and birth, growth and decay following predictable cycles. But she could withdraw her favor, and when she did, fields became barren, women couldn't conceive, the carefully established patterns broke down, and chaos returned. Utu, the sun god, travelled across the sky in predictable path, rising in the east, setting in the west, marking the passage of time with regularity. But this regularity was Utu's achievement, his cosmic duty assigned by the Anunnaki Council. Before his assignment, the tablets hint, the sun wandered irregularly, making time unpredictable, preventing the agricultural planning that civilization required. What all of this reveals is a worldview where natural law wasn't automatic, wasn't simply the way things are. Natural law was imposed, maintained, constantly upheld by divine beings who had organized chaos and who had to continue their organization to prevent reality from sliding back into formlessness. The Anunnaki weren't just powerful beings who happened to control aspects of reality. They were the reason reality had aspects at all. The reason storms followed patterns and rivers had boundaries and fertility operated in cycles, and the sun rose reliably rather than capriciously. This understanding permeated Sumerian ritual life. Temple offerings weren't just worship, they were maintenance, support for the gods' cosmic work, energy that allowed the Anunnaki to continue imposing order. When rituals lapsed, when offerings weren't made, the tablets described disasters, floods that ignored boundaries, droughts that lasted too long, storms that came out of season. Because the divine organization of reality required constant upkeep, and humans, created to serve the gods, bore responsibility for providing the resources and ritual energy that made that upkeep possible. The world before the Anunnaki organized it wasn't paradise. It was chaos, dangerous, formless, unable to support civilization. And the world the Anunnaki created wasn't static. It was maintained order, constantly upheld against the chaos that still existed at the boundaries, that still threatened whenever divine attention wavered or human service failed. The Sumerians lived in a reality they understood as contingent, dependent on forces greater than themselves, requiring constant relationship with the Anunnaki, who had made civilization possible, and who could, if they chose or if humans failed in their obligations, allow it to dissolve back into the formlessness from which it had been carved. In university archaeology departments, the Anunnaki are understood as deities in a polytheistic religion, mythological figures that explain natural phenomena and social hierarchy to Bronze Age Mesopotamians. Translations follow strict linguistic methodology. Interpretations remain grounded in cultural context. But outside academia, alternative theories flourish. Viewing the same tablets as evidence of ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, or lost technological civilizations. These interpretations, pioneered by Sitchin and expanded by others, find audiences frustrated with conventional archaeology's caution. The gap between scholarly and popular understanding of these tablets has never been wider. Yet even mainstream archaeologists acknowledge mysteries. The sudden appearance of sophisticated mathematics, the precision of astronomical observations, the consistent cross-cultural flood narratives, the absence of clear developmental stages for writing and urbanization. The tablets themselves resist easy categorization. They're too detailed to dismiss as pure fantasy, too consistent across cultures to attribute to coincidence, but too mythological in language to read as straightforward history. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere uncomfortable. The Sumerians were describing real experiences, real changes in their world, but in the only language available to them, the language of gods and cosmic transformation. The academic approach has strengths. It's rigorous, systematic, grounded in evidence and linguistic precision. When Assyriologists translate tablets, they follow established grammatical rules, compare multiple sources, note uncertainties and ambiguities. They place texts in historical and cultural context, understanding them as products of specific times and places. They avoid sensationalism, resist making claims beyond what evidence supports. This methodology has revealed a sophisticated civilization, complex religious systems, literary traditions that rival anything produced in the ancient world. The Sumerians emerge from scholarly work as fully human, grappling with questions of meaning and mortality, creating beautiful poetry, developing elaborate myths that express their understanding of existence. Their gods were like Greek gods or Norse gods or Egyptian gods, powerful beings in elaborate mythologies that explain the world through narrative rather than through what we'd call science. But the alternative interpretations, despite their methodological problems, ask questions that academic archaeology sometimes dismisses too quickly. If the Sumerians described the Anunnaki descending from heaven, why assume that's purely metaphorical? If they said civilization was taught rather than discovered, why are we confident that's wrong? If their mathematics and astronomy were remarkably sophisticated for Bronze Age culture, why not consider the possibility they inherited knowledge from earlier sources? Sitchin's specific claims have been thoroughly debunked. His translations were often simply incorrect. His understanding of Sumerian grammar was flawed. His interpretations ignored context and cherry-picked evidence. The 12th planet Nibiru he claimed the Sumerians described doesn't exist in their actual texts. His genetic engineering explanations for human creation imposed modern concepts on ancient mythological language in ways that violated the text's actual meaning. But the broader question his work raised, the question of whether we fully understand what the Sumerians were trying to communicate, remains valid. Our modern categories, our sharp division between myth and history, religion and science, metaphor and literal description, may not map cleanly onto Bronze Age Mesopotamian thought. When a Sumerian scribe wrote about the Anunnaki teaching mathematics, what did he mean? Was it purely religious attribution, giving gods credit for human achievement? Was it cultural memory of actual knowledge transmission from some earlier source? Was it describing an experience that our framework doesn't allow us to comprehend? The mysteries that even mainstream archaeologists acknowledge create space for these questions. Mathematical sophistication without apparent development, astronomical precision requiring long-term observation programs, sophisticated writing appearing suddenly, urban civilization accelerating in just a few centuries, cross-cultural flood narratives that suggest common memory of actual catastrophe. None of this proves alternative theories, but it does suggest that dismissing the tablets as pure mythology might be premature. Perhaps the Sumerians were describing real experiences using the conceptual tools available to them. Perhaps what they called gods were forces or beings or experiences that don't fit our categories, that we struggle to understand because our framework for interpreting reality differs fundamentally from theirs. Perhaps the tablets preserve truth, not literal truth that translates directly into modern language, but truth nonetheless, accurate description of how the Sumerians experienced their world and the forces that shaped it. The gap between academic and popular interpretation likely won't close. Scholars will continue insisting on linguistic rigor and cultural context. Alternative theorists will continue claiming hidden knowledge and lost civilizations. But the tablets themselves remain indifferent to interpretation, their cuneiform marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by scribes who believed they were preserving something important, something true, something that mattered enough to commit to permanent form. What that truth is, what the Sumerians were actually trying to communicate about the Anunnaki and the world before, and the transformation that the flood represented, may be something we're not yet equipped to fully understand. The distance between their world and ours, between Bronze Age Mesopotamian consciousness and modern scientific materialism, may be too vast for complete translation. But the effort to understand remains worthwhile, the question remains open, and the tablets remain, waiting for the interpretation that finally makes sense of what they're trying to say. Beneath all the mythology, the cosmic battles, the divine genealogies, the Sumerian tablets make one claim that modern civilization finds difficult to accept. We are not the first. Not the first advanced culture, not the first to build cities, not the first to possess sophisticated knowledge. According to the tablets, the world before the flood was more advanced in some ways, more directly connected to divine knowledge, more intimate with the forces we now consider supernatural. The flood destroyed that world, and what came after was diminished, a reconstruction that preserved fragments but lost the whole. Modern archaeology dates civilization's beginning to around 3500 BCE at the earliest. But the tablets speak of knowledge from before the flood, of wisdom inherited rather than discovered, of copies of texts whose origins recede into unknowable antiquity. The king lists that place rulers before the flood, the astronomical tablets that reference observations spanning thousands of years, the mathematical knowledge without apparent development. All of it suggests the Sumerians believed they were inheritors, not inventors. That the Anunnaki taught them civilization because civilization had existed before, in a world the waters washed away, leaving only memory pressed into indestructible clay, waiting for us to understand what was lost and why it mattered enough to preserve. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable claim for modern understanding, because it challenges our assumption of progress, our belief that civilization moves forward from primitive to advanced, from simple to complex. We assume we're the peak of human achievement, that earlier cultures were less sophisticated, less capable, gradually building toward the technological and organizational complexity we've achieved. But the Sumerian tablets describe the opposite trajectory. They speak of an earlier time when knowledge was more direct, when the connection between human and divine was closer, when lifespans were longer and understanding was greater. Not in all ways necessarily. The post-Diluvian world had its own achievements, its own technologies, its own forms of organization. But something had been lost, something the flood had washed away that could only be partially recovered. The King List is explicit about this. Before the flood, rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans shortened dramatically. This wasn't poetic exaggeration to the Sumerians. This was historical record, the documentation of a real change in the conditions of human existence. Something about reality itself had changed at the flood boundary. Some principle that allowed extended life in the earlier age no longer operated in the later one. The astronomical tablets that reference, quote, 38, quote, suggest knowledge was lost in the catastrophe. The post-Diluvian astronomers weren't making original observations. They were copying earlier records, preserving what had been known in the time before, maintaining traditions of knowledge that predated the current civilization. How far back did that knowledge go? The tablets don't say clearly, but they treat it as ancient even to the Sumerians, wisdom from a time beyond their own beginnings. The mathematical tablets show similar patterns. The sophistication is present from the earliest examples. There's no visible development from simple to complex operations. The knowledge appears already formed, as if inherited rather than discovered, transmitted from earlier sources whose origins the tablets themselves acknowledge as predating the civilization doing the copying. Modern archaeology resists this narrative because there's no physical evidence of a sophisticated pre-Diluvian civilization. No ruins older than the sites we know. No artifacts suggesting advanced culture before the Ubaid period. The material record shows gradual development, not sudden collapse and diminished reconstruction. So scholars interpret the tablets as mythology, humans projecting an idealized past, creating Golden Age narratives that explain present imperfections through decline from earlier perfection. But what if the evidence was washed away? What if the flood, whether universal or regional but devastating, destroyed the physical remains, while oral tradition preserved the memory? Clay tablets from before the flood wouldn't survive in flood layers. Mud brick architecture would dissolve. Wood and textile would rot. Only memory would remain, passed down through survivors, eventually recorded in the earliest writing as stories about the time before, when things were different, when the Anunnaki walked more directly among humans, when knowledge flowed more freely, when civilization existed in a form that was later lost and only partially recovered. The tablets preserve this memory with remarkable consistency. The antediluvian world was real, was sophisticated, was connected to divine knowledge in ways the post-diluvian world no longer experiences. The flood was the break, the catastrophe that reset everything. And what came after, what the Sumerians built and what we've inherited from them, is reconstruction, preservation of fragments, maintenance of traditions from a time that can never be fully recovered, because too much was lost, too much knowledge drowned. Too much direct connection to the Anunnaki was severed when the boundaries between divine and human realms became less permeable. This claim challenges us to reconsider what we know and how we know it. Archaeological evidence is limited to what survives. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If a sophisticated culture existed and was destroyed thoroughly enough, we might never find physical proof. All we'd have would be memory, tradition, stories pressed into clay by people who believed they were preserving something true, something important, something that mattered, because it explained where they came from and what had been lost and why their relationship to the divine was mediated through temples and ziggurats, rather than direct as it had been in the time their ancestors remembered, from before the waters rose and washed the old world away. The tablets remain, insisting on their truth, claiming knowledge of a world before, a time when the Anunnaki established civilization in a form more complete than what survived the flood. Whether we interpret this as mythology or memory, metaphor or history, the Sumerians themselves had no doubt. They were inheritors of something ancient, preservers of knowledge from a time they could only partly understand, scribes copying traditions that extended back beyond their ability to trace, maintaining connection to the Anunnaki who had taught their ancestors, who had organized chaos into cosmos, who'd created humanity for purpose, and whose presence, though diminished since the flood, still governed the reality within which civilization struggled to maintain the order that those ancient gods had first imposed when the world was young, and the boundaries between heaven and earth had not yet been so firmly, so finally, so irreversibly drawn. And so the tablets rest now in museum cases, behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. The clay that once was soft beneath a scribe's stylus, pressed into shape 4,000 years ago in temples that have long since crumbled to dust, remains harder than the civilizations that have risen and fallen since those words were written. The Anunnaki, whether gods or memories or something our language cannot properly name, exist now only in these marks, these wedges pressed into mud that fire turned to stone. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to wait, patient as clay, until the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. The Sumerians believed they were inheritors of something older, preservers of wisdom from before the flood, scribes copying mysteries that extended beyond their ability to fully comprehend. And now we inherit their inheritance, reading their copies of copies, trying to understand what they were trying to preserve across the vast distance of time that separates their world from ours. They watch the same stars we watch, these ancient observers who tracked Venus with such precision, who mapped the heavens with such care. They wondered about the same questions we wonder about. Where did we come from? What forces shaped us? Are we alone in the cosmos, or has something greater touched us, taught us, made us what we are? They pressed their answers into wet clay, and the clay remembers even though the hands that shaped it have been dust for millennia. So let yourself drift now, into the same darkness those ancient scribes knew, working by lamplight in temple archives, preserving stories about gods who descended and a world that ended, a knowledge that survived only because someone thought it mattered enough to write down, to bake into permanence, to send forward through time like a message in a bottle, waiting for someone distant enough to understand what was being said. You're connected to them across all those years, part of the same human story of watching, wondering, trying to make sense of forces greater than ourselves. The tablets will still be there tomorrow, still holding their mysteries, still waiting with the patience of baked clay to share what they know. Rest now. The ancient world will keep. The Anunnaki, whatever they were, have already waited 4,000 years. They can wait until morning, sleep,